Hi guys, and welcome to Bedtime History Relaxing. Tonight we imagine you stepping out of a frozen world and into the narrow, echoing safety of a medieval abbey as a snowstorm swallows everything behind you. The wind does not just blow, it pushes, like it wants to erase the road, the forest, and maybe even your decision to travel today. You probably won't survive this, at least not comfortably. If you stay out there much longer, somewhere ahead, a bell rings through the whiteout, and you realize it is either salvation or a warning, and you are not sure which one you prefer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world, because there is something strangely grounding about knowing someone is listening in another night somewhere else. Now, dim the lights, flow straight into the story, no extra headings. You are standing on a narrow track that cuts through winterland so white it almost hurts to look at it. The air is sharp in your throat. Every breath a small shock of cold that makes you feel more awake than you want to be. Ahead of you, half swallowed by swirling snow, is the outline of an abbey gate. It does not look welcoming at first. It looks like something that has been standing there too long, watching too many travellers hesitate. This is the kind of place that once followed the Benedictine rule, a real framework of monastic life that spread across medieval Europe, shaping how monks worked, prayed, and, importantly for you right now, how they were required to receive strangers. Hospitality was not optional in theory, it was a duty, a sacred obligation, but as you approach, you cannot help wondering how often duty feels warm in practice. The gate itself is heavy wood reinforced with iron bands, darkened by centuries of weather. Snow clings to it in uneven layers, like the storm is trying to bury the entrance and forget it exists. You raise a hand to knock, but before your knuckles make contact, the sound of the wind shifts. It almost feels like the building is listening first. There is a mainstream historical fact here that might comfort you slightly, or maybe not at all. Many medieval abbeys were designed as self-sufficient communities, almost like small fortified towns. They had farms, bakeries, workshops, and guest accommodations because travellers were expected. Even in harsh winters like this, roads were unreliable, and storms like this were not rare exceptions. They were part of life. So in a strange way, you're exactly the kind of person this place was built for. And yet, standing here, you still feel like you're interrupting something ancient and private. The gate opens with a groan that feels too human. Warm air spills out, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and something like cooked barley. It is not luxurious, but it is different from the emptiness outside. Behind the opening stands a figure in a heavy robe, face partially shadowed by a hood, the guest master. Though you do not know that word yet, he studies you without hurry, as if travellers arriving in storms are simply another part of his day, like prayer or bread preparation. He says nothing at first, just steps aside. You enter. The moment you cross the threshold, the world changes in a way that feels almost physical. The wind disappears behind you as if someone closed a door on reality itself. The snow is still visible beyond the gate, but now it feels distant, muted, like a memory you are already starting to question. Inside, the cloister opens around you in a square of stone walkways and arches. The sound is different here, not silence exactly, but a softened version of the world. Your footsteps echo too clearly, like the building is reminding you that you are the only irregular thing in it right now. Monastic cloisters like this were common across Europe, especially in major religious centres during the medieval period, serving as both spiritual and practical spaces. Monks walked these corridors daily, reading, praying, and moving between duties. But standing here, you do not think about routine, you think about scale, about how small you suddenly feel inside something that has outlived entire generations. A quirky detail you might not expect is that some monasteries reportedly used bell signals not just for prayer hours, but also to mark practical tasks like meal preparation or even warning of approaching travellers in poor visibility. Some records suggest bells could be heard miles away in still winter air, though historians still argue whether these accounts are exaggerated by later storytellers who liked dramatic soundscapes. You hear none of that now, only your own breath and the faint drip of melting snow from your cloak. The guest master finally speaks, his voice low and steady, and gestures for you to follow. You do. There is no ceremony, no questions about where you come from, no dramatic suspicion, just movement through stone corridors that seem to absorb all warmth. As you walk, you notice how the architecture presses in gently. Arches curve overhead like frozen waves. The stone is thick, built for endurance more than comfort. It is the kind of construction that makes you think of centuries rather than seasons. Romanesque design, with its heavy walls and rounded forms, was common in this era, built to last and to inspire awe through solidity rather than decoration. Your boots scrape softly against the floor, and each sound feels too loud. Somewhere deeper in the Abbey, you hear another set of footsteps, slower, synchronized, almost ritualistic. You are not part of that rhythm, not yet. The guest master leads you toward what must be the guest wing. You pass a small courtyard where snow has begun to gather again. Even inside the protection of the walls, it is not as warm here as you expected. In fact, the cold seems to have settled into the stone itself, as if winter has learned how to live indoors. A fringe historical anecdote you might enjoy, or question, is the idea that some medieval abbeys use scented herbs or soak mixtures in entrance areas to welcome guests and mask the smell of damp winter clothing. There is limited evidence for how widespread this practice truly was, and historians still argue whether such accounts are symbolic embellishments or grounded in real routine practice. You are led past that thought and deeper inside. At one point, you catch a glimpse of a larger hall where figures in dark robes move quietly. No one looks at you directly. It is not rudeness. It is discipline. Attention is reserved for tasks, prayers, and silence. You are simply passing through their structured world, like weather passing through a landscape. The guest master stops at a narrow door. He opens it without flourish. The room inside is small. Stone walls, a wooden bed frame, a straw-filled mattress, a wool blanket folded neatly at the end, a basin of water that looks like it might freeze if left alone too long. There is no decoration, no softness beyond necessity, and yet it is shelter. Medieval hospitality often worked like this. Shelter was provided, but comfort was not guaranteed. Inns existed outside monasteries, but abbeys like this were sometimes safer, especially during winter storms when roads became impassable and bandit activity increased. So the value was protection, not luxury. The guest master leaves you with a slight nod. No speech, just presence and then absence. You're alone now, in a room that feels both safe and strangely exposed. Outside the small window, the snowstorm continues, pressing against the world like a living thing, and as you stand there, you realise the Abbey is not quiet because nothing is happening. It is quiet because everything here is controlled, measured, and intentionally contained. You sit on the edge of the bed. The straw shifts beneath you with a dry rustle that sounds almost like distant leaves. And for the first time since arriving, you allow yourself to breathe without urgency. You follow the guest master deeper into the Abbey, leaving the small guest room behind, and the door closes with a sound that feels softer than wood should sound. It is strange how quickly the world outside becomes something you are no longer inside of. The storm is still raging beyond the walls, but here it feels like it belongs to another story entirely, one that is happening at a great distance. Behind thick stone and thicker time, the corridor opens into the cloister, and the change is immediate. It is not just quieter, It is as if sound itself has been taught to behave. You notice it first in your footsteps. They do not echo the way you expect. Instead, they land and dissolve, absorbed by stone that seems to understand its role in keeping things contained. Cloisters in medieval monasteries were designed as enclosed walking spaces around a central courtyard, and in many Benedictine houses across Europe they were the heart of daily movement. Monks used them to travel between prayer, study and labour, always in a rhythm that repeated through the hours like breathing. Here, that rhythm feels paused for you, but not broken. The cloister courtyard sits in the centre, a square of open air surrounded by covered walkways. In warmer months, it would likely hold a garden, often called the cloister garth, planted with herbs used for medicine, cooking, and simple remedies. In winter like this, it is only a shallow depression of snow, uneven and untouched, as if the garden has withdrawn into itself. You walk along the covered arcade. Stone columns rise at regular intervals, supporting arches that curve gently overhead. Each arch feels like a frozen wave, paused mid-motion. The Romanesque style is unmistakable, heavy and rounded, built not for elegance alone, but for permanence. These structures were common across medieval Europe, especially between the 10th and 12th centuries, when monasteries expanded rapidly as centres of faith, and agriculture. A mainstream historical fact you might find grounding here is that cloisters were not just spiritual spaces, but practical ones too. They functioned as sheltered corridors for movement in all weather, allowing monastic life to continue regardless of storms, heat, or seasonal disruption. Everything in the Abbey was designed around continuity. Prayer, work, and rest were arranged so the building itself supported discipline. You run your fingers lightly along the stone as you walk. It is cold enough that it almost feels damp, though there is no moisture, just the memory of weather embedded in the material. The guest master walks slightly ahead of you, never rushing, never turning to check if you're still following. There is a confidence in his pace that suggests he already knows every step of this route by heart. You begin to notice that no one here seems to hurry. Even urgency feels out of place. Somewhere beyond the cloister walls, you hear a faint bell. It is distant, almost swallowed by stone, but it carries a pattern. Not random, structured. Medieval monasteries often used bells to mark the liturgical hours, dividing the day into segments of prayer known as the divine office. These sounds regulated life so precisely that monks could often tell the time of day without seeing the sun. In this moment, however, the bell feels less like a clock and more like a heartbeat of the building itself. You pass an open archway and glimpse a larger hall beyond. Figures in dark robes move inside, slow and deliberate. They do not speak loudly, if they speak at all. It is in tones that barely rise above the air. The silence here is not absence, it is discipline. A quirky detail from some medieval monastic accounts suggests that certain cloisters were designed with subtle acoustic effects, where sound would travel in unusual ways along the arcades, creating the impression that voices were closer or farther away than they actually were. Some scholars think this was intentional, meant to encourage contemplation. Others believe it is simply the result of stone geometry and later storytelling exaggeration. Either way, you feel slightly aware of your own voice, even though you have not spoken. The cloister garden, even in its frozen state, draws your attention again. Snow outlines what might once have been planting beds. In warmer months, these spaces were often used for medicinal herbs like sage, mint, and lavender. Monastic gardens were crucial to early European medicine, preserving knowledge that would later influence apothecaries and early hospitals. Historians still argue whether cloister gardens were primarily symbolic representations of Eden, or whether they were designed first and foremost for practical survival. The truth likely sits somewhere between devotion and necessity, as it often does in medieval life. The air inside the cloister is colder than you expect it, but not biting. It is a steady cold, the kind that settles rather than attacks. You adjust your cloak slightly, feeling the wool hold on to whatever warmth you brought in from outside. As you continue walking, you notice small details that you missed at first. Carved stone capitals at the tops of columns, some showing simple geometric patterns, others faintly suggesting leaves or vines. Time has softened them, but not erased them. You wonder how many hands shaped these surfaces, how many winters passed while they worked. The guest master finally slows near a junction in the Cloister walk. He gestures ahead, where another corridor leads deeper into the Abbey's interior. You catch a glimpse of a door slightly ajar, beyond which the light is warmer, more golden. Before you move forward, you pause without meaning to. It is here that the silence feels most intense. Not because it is empty, but because it feels intentional, as if every sound you make would need permission to exist. Another historical detail settles in your mind as you stand there. Many monastic communities followed strict schedules that divided the day into prayer, reading, manual labour, and rest. This structure, especially within Benedictine tradition, was meant to balance spiritual devotion with physical discipline. Yet some historians still argue whether this strict austere was more about spiritual enlightenment or about maintaining control within isolated communities. You do not have time to resolve that thought, because the guest master has already begun walking again. You follow as you move deeper into the cloister. The outside world feels further away than distance alone can explain. The storm beyond the walls is still there, still pressing against the world, but here it feels like a memory you borrowed rather than a place you came from. The stone beneath your feet changes slightly in texture, more worn, more travelled. You realise this is not a place of arrival, it is a place of passage. People have walked here for centuries, repeating the same quiet journey between rooms, between duties, between prayers. And yet, you're aware of something slightly unsettling beneath the calm. It is the sense that the building remembers movement better than it remembers individuals. A faint draught moves through the arcade, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke from somewhere deeper inside the Abbey. You imagine kitchens, ovens, simple meals prepared with careful routine, bread, broth, perhaps barley stew, nothing extravagant, but enough to sustain bodies that were expected to rise early and sleep early in alignment with prayer hours and daylight. You pass another archway and briefly see a monk kneeling near a wall, perhaps adjusting something at floor level. He does not look up. His attention is fully elsewhere, absorbed in a task that feels both small and essential. The guest master stops again at another door, this one heavier, reinforced, more solid than the others you have seen. He places a hand on it but does not open it yet. You stand behind him, waiting. The cloister behind you is still, but not empty. It feels like it is holding its breath, and as you wait there, you begin to understand something without being told. The Abbey is not simply shelter. It is structure. Every sound, every movement, every silence has a place it is allowed to be. The guest master finally pushes the door inward. Warm light spills out, and you step closer to whatever waits beyond the cloister's careful quiet. The door opens wider, and the warm light does not just spill out, it pulls at you. It is a different kind of warmth than you imagined from the outside, not the soft glow of comfort, but the concentrated heat of controlled fire, contained within stone walls that have learned how to hold it carefully. You step through the threshold and immediately feel the contrast. Behind you is the cloister's measured cold. Ahead of you is a hall that feels alive in a quieter, steadier way. The guest master leads you inside without ceremony. The space is larger than the corridor, but not grand in the way modern imagination might expect. It is functional, structured, built for gathering rather than display. Long wooden beams support a ceiling darkened by smoke that has risen slowly over years, leaving traces of countless fires embedded in the timber above. A hearth burns along one wall, not a roaring blaze, but a disciplined fire. It glows orange and steady, like something trained rather than wild. Around it, the air smells of wood ash, cooked grains, and damp wool drying slowly in the heat. You feel your fingers begin to sting as they thaw. This is the guest hall, or hospitium, a space common in medieval abbeys across Europe where travellers were received. A mainstream historical fact here is that monastic hospitality was formally regulated in many orders, especially under the Benedictine rule, which instructed monasteries to receive guests as if they were receiving Christ himself. That instruction shapes centuries of practice, though the emotional reality of it likely varied from place to place. The guest master stops near a long wooden table, scarred with age, its surface marked by knife cuts, bowls, and countless hands. He gestures for you to stand there while he retrieves something from a side alcove. You notice others in the hall now. A few figures sit quietly along the benches, travellers like you, or perhaps pilgrims. Their cloaks are damp, their faces tired in that familiar way that comes from long roads and uncertain weather. No one speaks loudly. Conversations exist in fragments, not sentences. The guest master returns with a basin of warm water. He sets it down in front of you. You're expected to wash, not in a ceremonial sense, but in a practical one. Medieval hospitality often included washing of hands and feet for travellers, both for cleanliness and symbolic purification before entering communal spaces. It was a gesture rooted in ancient traditions that blended hygiene, humility, and ritual care. As you lower your hands into the water, the warmth feels almost startling. It is not luxurious, but it is human. The kind of warmth that suggests effort has been made for you specifically, even if you are not the centre of attention. A quirky detail from some medieval records mentions that certain monasteries kept separate basins for guests of different social ranks, though historians still argue whether these distinctions were strictly enforced or exaggerated by later chroniclers who liked emphasising hierarchy. What is clear, however, is that hospitality in this period was rarely completely equal. Even when generosity was sincerely intended, you're given a cloth to dry your hands, rough linen, practical and slightly coarse against your skin. The guest master watches briefly, then turns away as if satisfied that the process is complete. He speaks for the first time since entering the hall in a fuller way. His voice remains calm, but carries weight, like someone used to repeating the same instructions many times without needing variation. Food will be brought. You are to rest. You are to remain within the guest area until morning prayers are complete. Simple rules, delivered without emphasis, as if they are not commands but descriptions of how the building works. You nod, though no acknowledgement seems required. The guest master moves to a nearby wooden register, a large book resting on a stand. You watch as he dips a quill into ink and writes something down, likely your arrival, your status as traveller, perhaps a note about the storm. Medieval monasteries often kept guest registers, particularly in larger houses, recording names, origins, and sometimes intentions. These records served both practical and administrative purposes, helping track visitors in times when roads were unpredictable and political tensions could make strangers a concern as much as a duty. You wonder what your entry looks like in his careful handwriting. Just another line among many. A faint smell of bread reaches you now, carried from somewhere deeper in the building. It is simple, but it changes the atmosphere of the room. Hunger, which you had been ignoring, begins to surface more clearly. The guestmaster finishes writing and closes the register. He does not show it to you. Instead, he returns it to its place with quiet precision. There is a pause. In that pause, you notice the architecture more closely. The hall is supported by thick beams, the walls plain stone that has been smoothed by time and smoke. Small windows sit high above, allowing in only faint traces of the storm outside. In winter, These spaces would be dim most of the day, lit primarily by fire and candlelight. Light here is not abundant, it is managed. A mainstream historical fact worth noting is that medieval monastic communities often prioritize communal dining and structured meal times as part of their spiritual discipline. Meals were not just about nourishment, but about order, reflection, and shared rhythm. Everyone ate together, often in silence or with readings from scripture or religious texts. You glance toward one of the benches where a monk sits, head slightly bowed. He is not eating yet. He seems to be waiting. Perhaps for a signal only he understands. The guest master finally gestures toward a bench near the fire. You sit. The wood is warm from previous use, and the heat from the hearth reaches you in slow waves. Your wet gloves and cloak begin to release steam, faint and curling upward into the smoky air. For a moment, you simply exist in the warmth without needing to decide anything. Then a small bowl is placed in front of you. It contains a simple broth, pale, steaming, with bits of grain and possibly vegetables softened into near invisibility. There is no garnish, no presentation, just sustenance. Alongside it, a piece of bread, dense and dark, the kind that holds its shape even when broken. You take a sip. It is hot, slightly salty, honest in a way that surprises you. A fringe historical tidbit suggests that some abbeys may have adjusted their guest meals depending on seasonal harvest surplus, meaning winter hospitality could be noticeably simpler than summer offerings. Archaeological interpretations of monastic waste deposits support this idea, though historians still argue whether these differences reflect intentional policy or simply agricultural reality. As you eat, you become more aware of the other guests in the hall. Their movements are quiet, deliberate. Some speak in low tones, but most do not. The room feels like it is designed to hold people without demanding interaction from them. The guest master stands near the edge of the hall now, watching without watching. His presence is not intrusive, but it is continuous, like part of the architecture. You notice a small doorway at the far end of the hall, where servants or lay brothers move in and out carrying bowls and utensils. Their movements are efficient, practiced, nothing wasted. Historians still argue whether monastic hospitality was primarily an expression of spiritual charity or a sophisticated system for maintaining social and economic stability in a time of uncertain travel. Both interpretations seem plausible as you sit here, holding a bowl that required someone's labour, planning, and resources. Outside, beyond the walls, the snowstorm continues its work. You cannot see it, but you feel its presence in the way the building subtly cools near the edges, as if the world is pressing against stone trying to remind you it is still there. Inside, however, everything is contained. The guest master approaches once more. This time he does not bring instructions or objects. He simply stands near you for a moment, as if confirming your arrival has been properly integrated into the Abbey's rhythm. Then he speaks again. You are safe here tonight. The roads will not hold. It is not comfort exactly, it is assessment. But it still changes something in your body, loosening the tension you did not realize you were holding. He turns to leave, and as he does, you realize something subtle but important. You are no longer just passing through, for tonight, at least. You belong to the structure of this place. The fire continues to burn steadily beside you, and the hall continues its quiet, disciplined life around it, as if you've always been part of this measured rhythm, even if only for a single winter night. The warmth of the guest hall still clings to you as you rise from the bench, but it does not follow you for long. The guest master appears again at your side with the quiet certainty of someone who has already decided your next step before you are aware a step was coming. He does not ask if you are ready. He simply turns and begins walking. You follow. The firelight fades behind you as you leave the main hall, and almost immediately the air changes. It is subtle at first, like stepping through an invisible curtain, but then it settles into your bones. The corridor ahead is narrower than the cloister, less forgiving in its proportions. The stone here is older in feeling, though not necessarily in fact. It has the worn patience of surfaces that have hosted centuries of passing bodies. Your footsteps return to echoing, though not loudly. The Abbey seems to adjust sound depending on where you are, as if it is deciding how much of you the building is willing to hear. You pass a small alcove where a candle burns in a shallow recess. Its flame bends slightly as you walk by, reacting to a draft you cannot see in medieval monastic buildings. Corridors like this often connected functional zones' guest spaces, infirmaries, storage rooms, and private cells. Everything was arranged not for convenience in a modern sense, but for disciplined separation of roles and purposes. The guest master does not speak, he leads you deeper, past a turning where the warmth from the hall disappears entirely. Now the cold returns, not as an assault, but as a steady presence, like something that has always been here waiting for you to notice it again. A few steps later, you realize the sound of the storm outside has almost vanished. The walls are thick enough that even Winter's voice is reduced to a suggestion. It is strange how silence can feel denser than noise. You pass a wooden door with a small carved symbol above it, simple and worn smooth. Some monastic houses marked guest quarters or transitional rooms with modest carvings or symbols, though the exact meanings were often local and inconsistent. Surviving architectural records from the medieval period show a surprising diversity in how space was organised, even among orders that shared the same spiritual rules. One lesser-known detail is that guest accommodations were sometimes intentionally placed away from the main cloister to preserve monastic discipline, keeping outside influence contained but still honoured. The guest master stops at the end of the corridor. There is a door here that looks less decorative than the others. It is plain wood reinforced with iron nails, practical rather than symbolic. He places his hand on it, pausing for just a moment, as if confirming something invisible, then pushes it open. Cold air spills out. It is immediate and physical, like stepping into a shadow that has weight. Inside is your room, or rather, your cell, though the term feels too severe for what it is meant to be. Still, the simplicity of it leans toward that word. Stone walls, narrow and unadorned. A small bed frame against one side constructed of rough timber. A straw mattress lies upon it, uneven in thickness, its surface slightly compressed in places where previous travellers must have rested. A wool blanket is folded at the foot, thick but coarse. There is no fireplace, no brazier, no visible source of heat. Only the memory of warmth you left behind in the hall. Medieval guest cells in many abbeys across Europe were designed with stark practicality. They were not intended for comfort in the modern sense, but for shelter from the elements. Records from monastic architecture studies show that such rooms often prioritized insulation through thick stone walls rather than internal heating system, which were expensive and difficult to maintain. Heat came indirectly, from shared halls or adjoining rooms when possible. The guest master steps inside just long enough to place a small clay jug of water on a wooden stool. He does not linger. His presence in the room feels like a brief correction to its emptiness. You notice the window immediately. It is small, high, and deeply set into the wall, outside it. The snowstorm still moves, but it appears distant now, as if you are watching it from beneath the surface of the world. A quirky detail from some monastic inventories mentions that guest rooms sometimes included small straw cushions or bundled herbs placed under bedding, not only for scent, but also for practical reasons like deterring insects or dampness. Archaeological findings from excavated monastic sites support the presence of plant materials such as lavender or wormwood in sleeping areas, though whether this was consistent practice or occasional luxury remains debate. The guest master finally speaks. Rest here. Morning will bring with instruction. His voice is not unkind, it is simply final in a way that discourages further conversation. He leaves, the door closes, and the sound it makes is surprisingly soft for something so solid. You stand still for a moment in the centre of the room, letting your eyes adjust. The darkness here is not complete, but it is heavy. It carries the texture of stone and the absence of fire. You can feel the temperature difference between this space and the corridor outside, as if the room is slightly detached from the rest of the building's warmth system. You set your hand on the bed frame. The wood is cold but not damp. It has been used but not worn out. That balance between care and austerity defines much of medieval monastic hospitality. Everything is functional, nothing excessive, yet nothing entirely neglectful either. You sit on the edge of the bed. The straw shifts beneath you with a faint rustling sound, like dry grass moving in a wind you cannot see. It is not uncomfortable, but it is not inviting either. It simply exists for its purpose. Outside the window, the storm continues its slow erasure of the landscape. Snow presses against the glass in uneven patterns, melting and reforming as the wind changes direction. You wonder how many travellers have sat in rooms like this before you, listening to the same muted world. There is an ongoing academic debate about whether medieval guest accommodations should be interpreted primarily as acts of charity or as carefully structured systems of social and institutional management. Some scholars emphasize the spiritual framework of hospitality, while others highlight the logistical necessity of maintaining safe lodging networks across dangerous travel routes. Both interpretations feel present here, layered into stone and silence. You remove your gloves slowly, placing them beside the jug of water. The skin of your hands is still tingling from the earlier warmth of the hall. Now fading into memory, for a moment, you simply sit. The silence in this room is different from the Cloister silence. That one was disciplined. This one is personal. It feels less like an imposed order and more like a condition of being alone within something much larger than yourself. You lie back slightly, testing the bed. It responds with a soft creak, the sound absorbed quickly by stone above you. The ceiling is low enough that it encourages stillness. Not confinement exactly, but containment. A reminder that rest here is meant to be functional, not indulgent. Somewhere in the distance, beyond walls and corridors, you think you hear a bell. It is faint, almost imagined. Monastic communities often structured nighttime hours with specific prayer signals, even during the deepest part of winter. These sounds mark time not for productivity, but for rhythm, for continuity, for a sense that the night itself was ordered rather than chaotic. You close your eyes for a moment, then open them again. The room has not changed, but your perception of it has begun to soften around the edges. The cold remains, but it is no longer urgent. It is simply part of the space, like the stone, like the straw, like the distant storm you cannot reach. And as you sit there, you begin to understand that medieval hospitality was not designed to erase discomfort. It was designed to make discomfort survivable. The bed holds your weight. The room holds your silence. And outside, the snow continues to fall, indifferent and endless, while inside, time begins to slow into something that feels almost like rest. The room settles around you after the door closes, not with silence exactly, but with a kind of contained stillness that feels deliberately shaped. You remain seated on the edge of the straw mattress, hands resting loosely in your lap. While the cold continues to exist in layers, you are slowly learning how to interpret. It is not the sharp cold of exposure anymore. It is the steady cold of architecture. Stone has its own climate. You notice it most in your breathing. Each exhale becomes faintly visible for a moment before dissolving into the dim air. The room does not warm, not really, but it accepts your presence in a way that makes the cold less aggressive. Medieval guest cells in monastic settings were often designed this way. prioritizing insulation through thickness rather than active heating. Surviving architectural studies suggest that comfort was secondary to durability, yet even within that limitation, builders understood how to reduce drafts and preserve body heat as much as possible. You shift slightly, and the bed frame responds with a soft creak. It is a sound that feels personal in a room that otherwise offers very little of it. Everything here is muted. Even your movements feel reduced in scale, as if the space is encouraging restraint. A small flicker of memory returns to the warmth of the guest hall. The controlled fire, the smell of bread and ash. It feels distant already, like something you passed through rather than experienced. That contrast is part of what medieval monastic design achieved without intention, or perhaps with subtle intention. Spaces were arranged not only for function, but for progression, moving travellers from communal warmth to private austerity in steps that mirrored spiritual transition. You glance toward the small window again. The snow is still there, pressing against the world beyond the glass. It does not fall in visible flakes anymore. Instead, it moves in blurred streaks, as if the storm itself has lost interest in definition. The glass is slightly uneven, handmade, imperfect. It distorts the outside world just enough that you cannot tell where storm ends and stone reflection begins. One lesser-known detail from archaeological interpretations of monastic sites is that window placement in guest rooms was often intentionally high and narrow. This limited direct exposure to drafts while also controlling the amount of light entering the space. Some historians suggest this design reflected both practical and symbolic priorities. Though there is ongoing academic disagreement about whether symbolism or environmental necessity was the primary driver, you stand and walk slowly toward the window. The floor beneath your feet is stone, but not perfectly flat. Centuries of wear have softened its surface in subtle ways. You can feel slight irregularities through your boots, like the accumulated memory of countless footsteps. At the window, you place your hand against the glass. It is colder than expected, almost painfully so at first contact. The storm outside appears closer here, even though you know it is physically distant. The wind pushes snow sideways, then upward, then in directions that do not seem to follow any stable pattern. Medieval chronicles from various regions of Europe frequently describe winter storms as almost living forces, shaping travel, politics, and survival. While some of these accounts are clearly exaggerated for narrative effect, climate research confirms that the period did experience significant seasonal variability, particularly during what is often referred to as the colder phases of the medieval climate fluctuations. You withdraw your hand from the glass slowly. Behind you, the room remains unchanged. The bed, the stool with the clay jug, the folded blanket. Nothing has moved, nothing is waiting. Yet the space feels less empty now that you are moving within it. You return to the bed and sit again, this time more fully settling into it. The straw shifts beneath your weight, producing a sound that is oddly organic, like dry vegetation responding to pressure. It is not soft, but it is not hostile either. It is simply there to support rest in the most literal sense. You begin to notice small details that were not immediately visible earlier. The blanket is not uniform in weave. It has slight variations in thickness, suggesting it was woven by hand, possibly in a monastic workshop or nearby village. Textile production in medieval Europe was often localized, with monasteries sometimes operating their own workshops for essential goods. Records from certain abbeys show that wool processing was a significant part of their economic activity, though the extent varied widely by region and order. A quieter observation emerges as you sit still. The room has a rhythm, but it is not auditory. It is spatial. The way light enters from the window, the way cold gathers in corners, the way your breath becomes visible and then disappears. Everything here moves in cycles that are slow enough to feel like permanence. You lie back fully now. The ceiling is closer than it seemed when you first entered. not oppressive, but attentive. Wooden beams run across it, darkened slightly by age and smoke infiltration from other parts of the Abbey. Even in rooms without direct fireplaces, smoke travelled through shared ventilation systems and structural gaps, leaving traces across surfaces over time. You imagine, briefly, how many travellers have looked up at this same ceiling? Pilgrim, merchants, wanderers caught in storms, all arriving with the same mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty. Some accounts from medieval travel narratives describe Abbey guest rooms as places of emotional suspension, where time felt temporarily detached from ordinary life. There is ongoing academic disagreement about whether such descriptions reflect actual lived experience or literary conventions designed to emphasize spiritual transformation. You close your eyes for a moment. The soundscape of the room is subtle, the faintest suggestion of wind outside, the occasional soft settling of wood as it adjusts to temperature differences. Your own breathing, slower now than before. When you open your eyes again, nothing has changed, yet something has softened in how you perceive it. You shift the blanket over yourself. It is heavier than expected. Dense wool that holds air within its weave. It does not warm the room, but it begins to stabilize your body's sense of temperature. Medieval wool production techniques were highly refined in many regions of Europe, with some surviving records indicating careful grading of pièce quality depending on intended use. Outer garments were often rougher, while bedding materials were selected for insulation. A faint memory surfaces of the guestmaster's voice, not warm, not cold, but final in its simplicity. Rest here. Morning will bring instruction. Instruction. The word feels neutral, not threatening. In monastic life, instruction was part of the daily rhythm, encompassing work assignments, prayer schedules, and travel guidance for guests. Life here was structured in segments, each with its own boundaries and expectations. You turn slightly on the bed. The straw shifts again, quieter now as your body adjusts to its shape. It is not designed to conform to you. You are the one who adapts. Outside, the storm continues its unseen work. Inside, the room remains unchanged, but your awareness of it begins to slow, as if your attention is gradually aligning with the pace of the building itself. There is a final detail you notice before sleep begins to approach. The way the air near the floor is colder than the air near the ceiling. A gentle gradient, barely perceptible, but real enough to feel once you become still long enough to sense it. It reminds you that even in stillness, the world is layered, and as your thoughts begin to loosen, the room no longer feels like a place you entered. It feels like a place you have been gradually absorbed into. Sleep does not arrive all at once, it approaches in layers, like the cold, like the silence, like the slow acceptance of being somewhere you cannot fully control. You are still aware of the room, even as it begins to blur at the edges. The straw mattress beneath you shifts slightly whenever you adjust your weight, and each small sound feels amplified in the quiet. The wool blanket lies heavy over your body, not warm in a modern sense, but steady, like it has decided to remain there regardless of what you do. Outside the small window, the snowstorm continues its unseen movement. You cannot hear it clearly anymore, but you can sense it in the faint pressure against the glass, in the way the cold in the room seems to pulse in subtle response to the wind beyond the walls. Medieval monastic buildings were often designed with this kind of sensory layering in mind, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of thick stone construction. Surviving architectural studies show that sound insulation in such structures was not absolute, but selective, allowing distant echoes like bells or wind to filter through while blocking direct exposure to chaos. It creates an environment where the outside world is acknowledged but softened, like a memory instead of a presence. You turn slightly on your side, the bed frame creaks again, a sound that feels almost like a reply from the room itself. It is not uncomfortable, but it is honest, Nothing here hides its material nature. Wood sounds like wood, stone feels like stone, air feels like absence of heat. Your breathing slows without instruction. In medieval Europe, sleep was often divided into segments rather than treated as a single uninterrupted block. Historical records and literary sources suggest a pattern sometimes referred to as segmented sleep, where people would sleep for a few hours, wake briefly during the night, and then return to rest. There is ongoing academic disagreement about how universal this practice truly was, but evidence from diaries, legal records, and monastic schedules suggests it was at least common in certain regions and communities. You're not following any schedule now, but the idea lingers in your thoughts as your awareness drifts in and out of focus. The ceiling above you is barely visible in the dimness, but you can still trace its outline. Wooden beams run across it like quiet lines of structure holding the world in place. There is comfort in that structure, even if it is not designed for comfort itself. You notice, faintly, the sound of water somewhere in the building, not flowing directly but shifting through pipes or channels embedded in stone. Monastic complexes often had carefully managed water system, including wells, cisterns, and drainage channels. Some abbeys in medieval Europe were remarkably advanced in their hydraulic planning, ensuring access to water for kitchens, gardens, and hygiene purposes. Records from archaeological surveys show that these systems could be surprisingly complex, though the extent of technological sophistication varied widely between regions. The sound fades again. Your body feels heavier now, not from weight, but from relaxation. The kind of heaviness that does not restrict movement but removes the need for it. You remember briefly the guestmaster's earlier instructions. Simple, precise, without emotional framing, rest. Morning will bring instruction. There was no reassurance offered beyond practicality. And yet somehow that practicality feels more grounding than comfort would have been. In monastic life, certainty often came from structure rather than sentiment. Hours were assigned, tasks were defined, even silence had rules. Some historians interpret this as a form of spiritual discipline, while others suggest it also functioned as a system of social control within isolated communities. Both interpretations coexist in academic discourse, reflecting the complexity of interpreting medieval institutional life. Your eyes close again, this time. They remain closed longer. The room does not change, but your perception of it continues to soften. The edges of objects lose definition. The blanket becomes less an object and more a field of warmth and weight. The bed becomes less a structure and more a support that no longer needs to be consciously acknowledged. Outside, the storm persists, though it no longer feels like something separate from the Abbey. It feels integrated into the world you are part of, even if only temporarily. You drift into a state where thoughts no longer form complete sequences. Instead, they appear as fragments. The sound of bells you may or may not have heard earlier. The warmth of the guest hall fire. The sight of stone arches passing overhead. The guest master's quiet movements. Each fragment floats briefly, then dissolves. A quieter detail surfaces in your awareness. Medieval monasteries often structured nighttime around specific prayer hours, including vigils or nocturnes, depending on the order and region. These were moments when monks would rise in the middle of the night to chant or pray, maintaining a rhythm that extended beyond natural sleep cycles. There is ongoing academic disagreement about whether this disrupted rest was experienced as hardship or spiritual discipline. But monastic writings often frame it as integral to the rhythm of devotion. The idea passes through your thoughts without attachment. You are no longer tracking time clearly. The room feels slightly warmer now. Though nothing has changed, it is possible your body has simply adjusted. Human perception of temperature is fluid, influenced by expectation, fatigue, and context. In environments like this, adaptation becomes part of survival. You shift once more under the blanket, and the sound of fabric moving is almost soothing in its simplicity. Somewhere in the distance, very faintly, you imagine a bell. It might be real or remembered. Monastic bells often mark transitions between hours, especially in larger abbeys where structured prayer defined the entire night. Records from medieval sources describe how even sleep was framed within spiritual cycles, though interpretations vary among historians regarding how strictly this was enforced in practice. The thought dissolves before it fully forms. Your breathing slows further. The room is no longer something you're observing. It is something you're within, without separation. Even the cold has lost its sharpness. It remains, but it no longer demands attention. You're not asleep yet, but you're no longer fully awake. There is a threshold in this state where awareness becomes optional, where the mind no longer insists on organizing experience. You're approaching that threshold now, gently, without force. The last clear sensation is the weight of the wool blanket, steady and continuous, like a quiet agreement between you and the room, and then even that begins to fade. Sleep does not fully take you yet, but it has already begun to rearrange your sense of time. The room feels less like a fixed place now and more like a slow current carrying you along its surface. You're still aware of the straw beneath your body, the wool over your chest, the faint cold pressing in from the stone walls, but all of it is becoming less defined, as if the edges are being gently rubbed away by repetition and stillness. Outside the window, the storm continues its work, not violently anymore, at least not in your perception. It is now something distant and abstract, like a moving texture beyond glass and stone. Medieval records from winter travel narratives often describe storms as forces that erased roads entirely, making familiar landscapes unrecognizable. Those accounts are sometimes dramatic, but climate reconstructions confirm that severe seasonal disruptions were common enough to shape how monasteries and settlements prepared for isolation. You shift slightly, and the bed responds with a quiet creak. Even that sound feels softer now, as if the room is lowering its volume in response to your fading awareness. Somewhere in the building, water moves again, a faint, uneven sound that might be pipes or channels carved into stone, or simply melting snow finding its way through old drainage systems. Monastic complexes often relied on intricate water management systems, drawing from nearby springs or rivers. Surviving architectural surveys show that some abbeys maintained remarkably efficient networks for washing, cooking, and agricultural use, reflecting a level of planning that often surprises modern observers. The thought passes without anchoring. You're not holding ideas anymore, you are letting them pass through. Your breathing slows further, becoming almost rhythmic in itself, aligning unconsciously with the stillness of the room. The wool blanket has settled fully over your body now, its weight no longer noticeable as separate pressure but as a uniform presence. It does not warm you so much as define your boundary in space. There is a faint shift in light from the window, though it is subtle enough that you might not notice unless you are already half asleep. Snow outside reflects what little ambient light remains, creating a dim, shifting glow that changes as the wind moves. Medieval monastic architecture often relied on this kind of indirect illumination during winter months. Candlelight and reflected outdoor light were primary sources of visibility in many spaces, especially in remote abbeys where resources were carefully managed. Some surviving architectural studies note that window placement and interior angles were sometimes adjusted to maximize even the smallest amount of available light during darker seasons. You are no longer thinking in structured sentences. Instead, fragments appear and dissolve, a hallway of arches, a fire contained within stone, a voice speaking without urgency, footsteps that do not rush, a door closing softly behind you. Each fragment exists briefly, then loosens its shape and fades. The idea of instruction returns faintly. As the guest master had said, morning will bring instruction. The word no longer feels directive, it feels like part of the environment, something that will arrive the same way light will arrive, without needing your participation. You turn your head slightly into the pillow of bundled straw. It shifts quietly, accommodating you without resistance. Straw mattresses in medieval guest rooms were practical solutions for bedding, often replaced periodically depending on availability and season. Some archaeological findings suggest that layers of plant material were sometimes reused or supplemented with fresh harvests. Depending on regional agricultural cycles, the detail passes without importance. Your awareness continues to thin, not disappearing but distributing itself more evenly across sensation rather than thought. There is a faint impression of bells again, though it is uncertain whether they are real or remembered. Monastic communities often structured night hours around prayer signals, especially in larger institutions where communal rhythm extended beyond daylight. These sounds mark transitions rather than urgency, reinforcing continuity across the night. The idea dissolves before it becomes complete. Your body is no longer negotiating with the cold. It has accepted it as background rather than threat. This is a subtle but important shift in perception. What once required attention now requires none. Somewhere deep in the structure of the Abbey, a door opens or closes. The sound is too distant to identify clearly. It might be real or imagined, filtered through layers of stone and sleep. You are approaching a state where distinctions lose importance. Stone, air, warmth, silence. They are no longer separate categories. They are just conditions. Your breathing becomes slower still. The ceiling, which you can no longer clearly see, feels less like something above you and more like an idea of containment. The room is no longer observed. It is simply present. Medieval monastic life was structured around cycles that extended even into rest. Sleep was not an escape from order, but part of it. Shaped by prayer hours and communal expectations, interpretations differ among researchers studying medieval daily life about how individuals experienced this rhythm internally. But textual evidence suggests that routine itself was a stabilizing force in environments that could otherwise be unpredictable. That thought appears without emphasis, then fades. You are no longer holding on to sequence. Only continuity remains. The storm outside is still active, but it has become irrelevant to your immediate sense of existence. It is happening, but not to you, not here, not now. The wool blanket shifts slightly as your body relaxes further into stillness. It no longer feels like an object, but like a boundary between awareness and disappearance. There is a final moment of clarity, brief and soft, where you're aware of being in a stone room within a larger stone structure, surrounded by winter, held by architecture that predates you by centuries. Then even that awareness begins to dissolve, and what remains is simply rest, unfolding without effort, without resistance, without need for direction. Sleep deepens now, not as a descent, but as a widening. It is as if the room you're in is slowly expanding beyond its stone boundaries, and you are no longer confined to a single bed in a cold guest cell, but drifting through the entire structure of the Abbey itself. Your awareness loosens further, the body remains still, but the mind begins to move in softer patterns, no longer forming clear thoughts, only impressions that rise and dissolve like breath in cold air. The storm outside continues, though it has lost any sense of direction in your perception. It is no longer wind against stone. It is simply motion beyond understanding, a distant pressure that belongs to another layer of reality, somewhere in the building. A bell sounds. It is faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the noise inside your own mind, but then it repeats, slow, measured, not urgent, but insistent in its rhythm. In many monastic communities across medieval Europe, bells structured the night as much as the day, marking the hours of vigil prayer long before sunrise. These signals allowed entire communities to exist in synchronized cycles of rest and devotion. even in darkness thick enough to erase all visual reference. The sound does not wake you. It folds into your sleep instead. You are no longer fully in the guest room. Now you are in corridors. Stone arches pass above you without your body moving. The cloister appears again, but altered, elongated, stretching further than it should, as if the architecture has forgotten where it ends. The garden in its centre is no longer snow-covered, but filled with pale, indistinct shapes that might once have been herbs or might be something else entirely. Reshaped by dream logic. You drift along the covered walkway. Footsteps echo somewhere nearby, though you cannot locate their source. Monastic buildings were often designed so that movement carried through connected corridors in subtle ways, allowing sound to travel without direct visibility. Even now, in your half-sleep state, the structure seems to preserve that property, turning space into resonance. A door opens in your awareness. Not the one to your room, but another one deeper inside the Abbey. Warm light spills out, similar to what you saw earlier in the guest hall, though now it feels distant, like a memory of warmth rather than warmth itself. You move toward it without deciding to move. Inside, figures pass quietly between tables. Their robes are dark, almost indistinguishable from shadow. They are not speaking, or if they are, the words do not form into language. In medieval monastic practice, nighttime gatherings were often held in silence or near silence, especially during the hours dedicated to nocturnal prayer cycles. These rhythms were designed to maintain continuity between waking and rest. Dissolving the sharp boundary between them, you feel no surprise. The hall shifts. Now it is not a hall, but a passage beneath the Abbey, lower and closer to the foundation. The air is cooler here, more saturated with earth. Stone changes in texture, becoming rougher, older, as if it has moved closer to its origin. Some archaeological studies of monastic sites reveal that many abbeys were built in layers over centuries, with foundations reused and expanded in ways that make their internal geography far more complex than surface maps suggest. You are aware of this complexity now, not as knowledge, but as sensation. The structure feels alive in its layering. Above you, faint movement continues. Below you, stillness deepens. You pass through a narrow corridor where water drips at irregular intervals. The sound is slow, patient, almost rhythmic. Medieval monastic water systems often relied on gravity-fed channels and carefully maintained drainage routes, ensuring that even large complexes could manage sanitation and supply without modern infrastructure. In dream form, this becomes less engineering and more presence, as if the building itself circulates something essential through hidden veins. Your body in the bed remains somewhere far away, or perhaps it is here too, simply distributed. A soft shift occurs in the atmosphere. You are now in the dormitory, long, low space. Rows of simple bedding arranged in quiet order. No individual distinction stands out clearly, only repetition of form. The space is dim, lit by something that is not quite light but not darkness either. It resembles memory filtered through sleep. Figures lie still in parallel lines. You cannot tell if they are asleep or if they are waiting. Monastic dormitories in many medieval orders were designed for communal rest, reinforcing shared rhythm even in sleep. Silence was maintained, and movement was minimal. Though some accounts suggest that nighttime awakenings for prayer or reflection were not uncommon in certain traditions, you move between them without disturbing anything. No one reacts. The air feels heavier here, not oppressive, but layered, as if each breath adds to a shared accumulation of stillness. A faint bell sounds again, this time closer. The sound changes the space. The dormitory dissolves into the cloister again, but now the snowstorm is inside the architecture. Snow drifts through arches that should be sheltered, passing through stone as if stone is no longer a boundary. Winter comes internalized, part of the structure rather than something outside it. You walk, though your walking has no footsteps. The guestmaster appears briefly at the edge of perception. He does not look at you directly. His presence is procedural, like part of the building's operating rhythm. In monastic systems, roles were often defined so precisely that individuals became extensions of function, moving through tasks that repeated daily, seasonally, across years. That repetition now feels embedded in the architecture itself. He gestures once toward a direction you do not interpret consciously, and then disappears. The corridor stretches. You pass under arches that seem to breathe slightly, expanding and contracting with slow regularity. This is not literal, but in dream logic it feels true. Stone is no longer inert, it is responsive. A fragment of warmth returns, the memory of the guest hall fire. It flickers briefly in your awareness, then becomes part of the corridor lighting, as if all sources of heat and light are merging into a single memory system distributed throughout the Abbey. You continue without choosing to continue. At some point, sound softens again. The bell fades into distance, the storm fades into absence. Only the rhythm remains, not of the building, but of something shared between you and it. A slow pulse of presence that does not require interpretation. Medieval monastic life structured itself around repetition, and repetition now becomes form rather than practice. Sleep, prayer, movement, silence, all of it begins to lose distinction. Blending into a continuous field where time is no longer segmented, you feel yourself descending again, though there is no downward direction, only deeper stillness. The last clear impression is of stone above and below, and between them a thin space where awareness continues to drift without anchor. Then even that begins to soften, and the Abbey, in its vast and quiet complexity, carries you further into its night. The rhythm changes again, though there is no clear moment where it begins. It is not a shift you notice with certainty. It is more like realizing that the space you're in has already become something slightly different from what it was before, as if the dream has adjusted itself while you are not paying attention. You are still within the Abbey, but the structure feels less horizontal now, more layered, more vertical, as if you are moving through levels that were always there but only now becoming accessible to perception. A bell sounds somewhere above you. It is not loud, it does not need to be. In this state, sound does not travel through air so much as through intention. Medieval monastic communities used night bells to mark vigils, especially during the hours long before dawn when most of the world was still. These signals structured what was known in some traditions as the night office cycle, a sequence of prayer moments that interrupted sleep in carefully measured intervals. You do not wake, you simply shift. Now you are walking again, though the word walking feels unnecessary. Movement is not physical here, it is a change in position within the architecture of thought. The corridor around you is narrower than before, but not oppressive. It feels more focused, like attention itself has been concentrated into stone passageways. The walls are close enough that you might expect them to press in, yet they do not, instead they guide. You pass small recesses in the stone where faint light flickers, not torches exactly, and not candles either, but something that resembles both in memory. Monastic buildings often relied on layered lighting systems during winter nights, combining oil lamps, hearth glow, and candlelight, depending on availability and function. Surviving records from some abbeys describe a careful rationing of light sources, especially in the colder months when resources were preserved for essential communal spaces. Here, lighter behaves differently. It appears where attention settles, then fades when it moves on. You reach a doorway that is already open. Beyond it is a room that feels quieter than silence. At first, it is difficult to define its purpose. The space is long and low, with shelves lining the walls. Surfaces hold objects that are not fully distinct yet, but gradually resolve into books, parchment, Inkstones, quills, a scriptorium emerges from the dream. Monastic scriptoria were central to medieval intellectual life, particularly between the 9th and 14th centuries in many regions of Europe. They served as the primary centres for copying and preserving texts, both religious and secular. Without them, many classical works would not have survived. Records suggest that scribes worked in carefully controlled conditions, balancing the need for light with the need for preservation of fragile materials. You move through the room without touching anything. Figures sit at long tables, bent over manuscripts. Their movements are slow, precise, almost meditative. The sound of scratching quills is faint but continuous, like a soft undertone to thought itself. One of them pauses, not to look at you directly, but as if sensing a change in air pressure, then continues writing. A small detail emerges in your awareness. Ink in medieval scriptoria was often made from mixtures that included soot, oak galls, and natural binders. These materials were carefully prepared, sometimes in monastic workshops themselves. One interesting detail preserved in some historical inventories suggests that certain monasteries maintained strict seasonal schedules for ink production, aligning preparation with environmental conditions. Though the extent of standardization varied widely, you move past the scribes. The room stretches further than expected, extending into a corridor that feels almost submerged in dimness. The architecture becomes less defined again, as if the scriptorium is dissolving into another space before fully completing itself. Now you are in an infirmary. The air changes immediately. It is softer, carrying faint herbal scents that are difficult to identify individually. Lavender, sage, and something more bitter that might be wormwood or dried medicinal roots. Monastic infirmaries in medieval Europe often combined practical care with herbal knowledge, preserving and transmitting early medical practices that would later influence apothecary traditions. Beds line the walls here, but they are empty, or perhaps they are not empty, only occupied by absence. You pass slowly between them. A figure stands near a table arranging small bundles of herbs. They do not acknowledge your presence. Their movements are careful, repetitive, almost ritualistic. Some surviving monastic records indicate that herbal remedies were categorized with surprising specificity, though interpretation of these classifications varies among modern researchers studying medieval medicine. You notice jars along the shelves. Some contain dried plants, others hold liquids that catch faint light and reflect it in muted tones. The infirmary feels neither restful nor clinical. It exists somewhere between care and discipline, like everything else in the Abbey. A bell sounds again. This time it feels closer still. The space responds. The infirmary dissolves into corridor again, but the corridor is no longer sinister, and it shifts slightly as you move, as if the architecture is adjusting to your awareness of it. Stone arches lean subtly into new angles, and passageways appear where none were visible before. You are no longer following a fixed layout. You're following rhythm. The rhythm leads you upward. There is a sense of ascent, though no stairs are clearly visible. Instead, you simply find yourself in higher spaces. The air becomes thinner, not in breathability, but in texture, less dense, more open. Now you're near the upper levels of the Abbey. Here, the storm outside becomes more noticeable again, not as sound, but as pressure against the structure. The wind moves across rooftops and towers, shifting snow in patterns that you cannot fully visualize but can feel in the way the building subtly responds. Medieval abbeys were often built with multiple functional levels, including upper dormitories, storage areas, and bell towers. Archaeological studies show that vertical organization was not only practical, but also symbolic in some architectural traditions, reflecting ideas of spiritual ascent, though interpretations differ among scholars studying ecclesiastical design. You enter a narrow passage that leads toward an opening. Cold air greets you again. You are not fully outside, but close to it, a tower space opens around you. Circular and high, the walls curve upward into darkness. Somewhere above, unseen mechanisms hold bells that have already sounded and will sound again. You feel the wind more strongly here. Though it does not touch you directly, it moves through the structure rather than around it, as if the tower is breathing winter in and out below. The Abbey exists in layers of quiet activity above. The storm continues its slow erasure of the night sky. You stand in between. A final image forms briefly in your awareness. The guest room where you began, far below. Stone and straw and wool blanket, isolated but held within this larger system of movement and stillness. Then that image softens. You are no longer tracking where you are within the structure, only that you are within it. The bell sounds once more, but now it feels distant again, completing its cycle rather than initiating anything new. And as the sound fades, the tower, the corridors, the infirmary, the scriptorium, all begin to merge into a single continuous presence. The Abbey is no longer a place you move through, it is the condition you are moving within. The tower does not feel like a place you have arrived at. It feels like a place you have been gradually becoming aware of. The wind moves through it in slow, uneven breaths, slipping between stone openings that were never meant to be fully sealed. You stand near the centre of the circular space. Though standing is more a concept than a confirmed sensation, the boundaries of your body feel less distinct here, as if the cold air and stone architecture are sharing responsibility for holding you in place, above you. The bell mechanism is somewhere in the darkness. You cannot see it clearly, but you can feel its presence in the way the air subtly tenses between each distant sound. Medieval bell towers in monastic complexes were often engineered with surprising precision, allowing large bronze bells to be suspended in ways that distributed weight evenly across thick stone supports. Surviving architectural studies show that these towers were not only functional, but carefully integrated into the spiritual rhythm of daily life. The bell sounds again, not as an announcement, but as continuation. You're no longer surprised by it. You're simply adjusting to its existence below you. The Abbey spreads out in layers that no longer feel separate. The guest hall, the cloister, the scriptorium, the infirmary, the corridors, the guest cell, where you first lay down. They are no longer locations. They are states within the same structure, accessible through shifts in attention rather than movement. You turn slightly, and the wind responds with a change in pressure. Stone here is not still. It is reactive in subtle ways, not alive in any literal sense, but responsive to environmental forces that have shaped it for centuries. In many medieval abbeys, particularly those built in exposed regions, towers were designed to endure constant wind pressure, snow accumulation, and seasonal temperature shifts. The result is architecture that feels less like static construction and more like long-term adaptation. You step closer to one of the narrow openings. Outside, the storm is still present, but it has lost definition. It is no longer snow falling through night. It is motion without origin, movement without direction. The landscape beyond the Abbey cannot be separated from the sky anymore. Everything is blended into a continuous grey-white field. You place your hand against the stone wall. It is colder than expected, but not sharp. More like stored winter, accumulated over time. Some surviving monastic records suggest that bell towers also served practical roles beyond liturgy. They were used for signalling travel conditions, marking danger, and coordinating agricultural labour in surrounding lands. These functions varied widely between regions and orders, with no single standardized practice across medieval Europe. Interpretations differ among researchers studying monastic infrastructure, especially when trying to separate symbolic purpose from practical necessity. The thought passes without anchoring. You're no longer organizing information in categories. A faint vibration passes through the tower. Another bell sequence begins, though it is not identical to the previous ones. The rhythm shifts slightly, as if the pattern itself is adjusting to time rather than repeating it. You close your eyes briefly. When you open them, the tower feels larger. Not physically larger, but perceptually expanded. The walls curve further away than before, and the space above seems deeper. The architecture no longer feels fixed in dimension, it feels interpretive. You move without choosing to move. Now you are on a narrow walkway that circles the interior of the tower. There is no visible floor in the conventional sense, only stone ledges that suggest direction. You follow them instinctively. Below. The Abbey is faintly visible through gaps in structure. Lights flicker in the distant rooms, though they are not stable enough to identify. Monastic communities often relied on carefully controlled lighting during night hours, especially in winter, when oil and candle resources had to be rationed. Archaeological evidence from excavated sites shows that lighting systems were often centralized in key communal areas, leaving peripheral spaces dim or entirely dark. Here, everything is dim, but not absent. You pass a niche in the wall where something is carved into stone. The shape is worn, possibly decorative, possibly symbolic. Medieval stonework often included markings whose meanings are no longer fully understood. Some may have been masons' marks, others devotional symbols, and some simply practical indicators for construction alignment. There is no single interpretation that applies universally. You continue. The bell sounds again, closer this time, though still not visible. It is not calling you. It is continuing a cycle that does not require participation. The tower begins to feel less like a structure and more like a rhythm made solid. You pause near another opening. The wind here is stronger, but it does not push you away. Instead, it seems to move through you, as if your presence is not separate from the airflow, but part of its path. Below, the Abbey's cloister appears faintly. The garden is still buried under snow, but you can almost sense the shape of it beneath the surface. Cloister gardens in medieval monastic settings often held medicinal plants, arranged in geometric patterns that reflected both practical cultivation and symbolic order. Some surviving layouts suggest careful planning of herb distribution, though there is no complete agreement among scholars about how standardized these designs truly were. The image fades as you shift attention. Now you are inside another corridor, though it connects seamlessly with the tower. There is no clear boundary between spaces anymore. Everything flows into everything else. A faint warmth appears. Not physical warmth, but memory of warmth. The guest hall fire, the controlled hearth, the smell of bread and ash. These impressions surface briefly, then dissolve into the stone again, as if the building is absorbing them and redistributing them as atmosphere. You move deeper into the upper structure. The architecture becomes quieter here, less inhabited, more observational. It feels like a space used for the maintenance of sound itself rather than daily life. Some medieval sources describe how bell towers required constant upkeep due to wind stress, temperature fluctuations, and mechanical wear. Metal components had to be regularly adjusted, wooden supports treated, ropes replaced. These tasks were often assigned to specific members of monastic communities, though exact roles differed depending on order and region. The information does not settle as fact, it floats as context. Another bell sequence begins, but now it feels almost internal, as if the sound is not entering the space but being generated within it. You stop trying to locate its origin. There is no origin that matters anymore. The tower, the abbey, the storm outside, the corridors below, the guest room far beneath everything. All of it exists as one continuous system of layered stillness and motion. You're not moving through it now. You're part of its structure of awareness. And as the bell fades again into the wind, the distinction between sound and silence begins to dissolve. What remains is continuity. The sense of continuity does not break, but it changes texture. What was once vertical movement through tower and corridor begins to flatten, as if the entire Abbey is now unfolding on a single plane of awareness. You are no longer ascending or descending, you are simply present within a structure that no longer insists on direction. The bell sound lingers in fragments, not a single tone but a fading impression of resonance, like ripples in stone rather than air. Medieval monastic bells were often cast with precise attention to harmonic overtones, allowing their sound to carry across long distances and varied terrain. Surviving metallurgical studies of bell casting suggest that even small differences in alloy composition could significantly affect tonal clarity. Though the full extent of medieval acoustic knowledge is still interpreted differently among specialists in historical sound engineering, the thought passes through without forming attachment. You are standing again in the cloister, though it does not feel like a return. It feels like the cloister has been present all along, waiting for attention to settle here. The garden in the centre is no longer simply snow-covered, it feels layered, as if multiple seasons are overlapping in the same space. Snow sits on top, but beneath it there is a sense of growth, of something paused rather than absent. Cloister gardens in medieval monastic life often served both symbolic and practical roles, and archaeological surveys from several sites indicate that planting patterns were sometimes preserved year-round even when vegetation was dormant. You walk along the arcade without conscious decision. Stone columns pass beside you at regular intervals, each one slightly different in wear, each one carrying subtle traces of contact from centuries of hands and weather. Monastic cloisters were designed to endure constant use, and surviving architectural records show that repairs were often made incrementally rather than through full reconstruction, allowing buildings to evolve slowly over generations. You notice your own presence differently now, not as a body moving through space, but as an alignment with it. The air here is neither warm nor cold, it is balanced in a way that resists definition. The storm outside is no longer something pressing against the walls, it exists, but it no longer competes for attention. A faint sound appears again, not a bell this time, but footsteps, soft, measured, approaching from somewhere within the cloister's connected corridors. You turn slightly, though the source is not visible yet. Figures emerge at the edge of perception, monks moving through their nightly rhythm. Though they are not fully distinct, their robes blend into the dimness of stone and shadow, creating silhouettes rather than individuals. Medieval monastic communities often structured night hours around repeated cycles of prayer, study and silence, with movement between spaces carefully regulated to maintain order and continuity. They pass without acknowledging you, or perhaps acknowledgement is not relevant here. You continue walking, the cloister extends further than before, or perhaps your awareness of it has expanded. The arches repeat with subtle variation, creating a rhythm that is visual rather than auditory. Each section of walkway feels like a variation on the same idea, adjusted slightly for light, angle, and time. One recessed alcove draws your attention. Inside, faint light flickers again, though it is not clear whether it comes from candle, lamp, or simply memory of illumination. Some surviving monastic records suggest that cloisters sometimes included small devotional lights or lamps in certain sections, though there is no uniform practice across different orders. Interpretations vary among researchers examining medieval religious lighting systems, particularly in colder regions where daylight was limited for much of the year. You do not stop, but you notice. The cloister begins to shift again. Now it feels less like a courtyard and more like a boundary between layers of experience. On one side, the interior life of the Abbey. On the other, something less defined, possibly the outside world, though that distinction is no longer clear. You pass through an archway. The stone changes slightly in colour, warmer in tone, though not in temperature. This subtle variation suggests either different phases of construction or restoration work over centuries. Archaeological studies of monastic architecture frequently reveal that abbeys were not built in single periods but expanded gradually, resulting in hybrid structures that reflect multiple architectural styles and historical phases. The corridor beyond is quieter, not in sound but in expectation. You sense less activity here, fewer rhythms of movement. It feels like a transitional space between functions, though function itself is becoming harder to define. A door appears ahead. It is open. Beyond it is the guest hall again, but it is not the same as before. The fire is still there, but it burns differently, lower, more subdued. The room is emptier, though you cannot tell whether that is due to absence of people or a shift in perception. Tables and settees remain, but they feel less like furniture and more like structural echoes. You step inside. The warmth is faint but present. The smell of wood smoke and grain returns, though it is diluted, as if carried through distance before reaching you. Medieval monastic hospitality halls often functioned continuously during winter nights when travellers were present, with fires maintained at controlled levels to conserve fuel while providing basic comfort. Surviving administrative records from some abbeys indicate careful monitoring of fuel usage, though the details vary widely across regions and orders. You move closer to the hearth. The flame does not grow, but it does not diminish either. It simply continues. A figure sits at the far end of the hall. You recognize the guest master, though his presence here feels less defined than before. He is not performing a task. He is simply there, as if part of the room's arrangement rather than its activity. You approach slowly. He does not turn immediately. When he does, the motion is unhurried, as if time around him adjusts slightly to accommodate the movement. He speaks without emphasis. The night is not finished. The words are not instruction. They are description. You stand still. The hall around you feels suspended, not frozen, but held in a state of equilibrium between use and rest. Some monastic sources describe night hours as times when the boundary between activity and contemplation becomes less distinct. Though interpretations differ among scholars studying medieval monastic temporal structures, the guest master rises. He does not gesture for you to follow, but the space itself suggests movement. You sense that the abbey is still unfolding, still revealing layers that were not previously accessible. The fire behind you continues its steady presence. The corridor ahead waits, and the structure of the abbey, in its quiet complexity, continues to guide awareness without force, without urgency, without separation between path and place. You begin to move again, not because you choose to, but because the space allows it. You move without resistance, but also without urgency. The guestmaster is no longer leading in any obvious way. Instead, it feels as though the hall itself is encouraging direction, subtle shifts in attention guiding you forward like currents beneath still water. The fire behind you remains steady, though it now feels less like warmth and more like a point of reference, something you could return to but are not meant to. The guest hall begins to dissolve in edges as you walk, not literally disappearing, but losing definition in the way dreams often soften familiar spaces. The benches blur into shadow. The table stretches slightly longer than it should, and the ceiling feels both higher and lower depending on where your attention rests. Medieval monastic spaces were often multifunctional, but surviving architectural studies also show that a perception of scale could shift depending on lighting, smoke levels, and time of day, especially in winter when illumination was minimal. You pass through a side archway. The corridor beyond is narrower than before, and the temperature drops again. The cold is not sudden. It is layered, as if you are passing through accumulated winter stored within the stone itself. Many monastic buildings in medieval Europe were constructed using dense local stone that retained temperature for long periods, making interior environments highly responsive to seasonal shifts. Your footsteps feel softer here, not because sound has changed, but because attention has. The guestmaster is ahead, though not clearly separated from the environment. At times he appears as a figure, at others as a movement within the architecture, as if he's part of the building's logic rather than an independent presence. You realize you are no longer following him in a traditional sense. You are following continuity. The corridor opens into a transitional space that feels neither interior nor exterior. A covered walkway bridges two sections of the Abbey. On one side, faint light leaks from a series of narrow windows. On the other, darkness presses close, though it is not empty. It feels populated by weather, by wind, by the presence of the storm that continues outside the structure. Medieval monastic complexes often included such transitional passages, allowing movement between buildings without direct exposure to harsh weather. Archaeological layouts show that these connecting spaces were carefully planned to maintain functional continuity during winter months, especially in regions prone to heavy snowfall. You pause briefly. The storm outside is no longer just a background condition. It feels like a parallel system, moving alongside the Abbey but never fully intersecting it. Snow is visible through gaps in structure, but it does not enter. It simply exists adjacent to the stone world you're within. A faint sound returns. Not a bell this time. It is something more subtle, a rhythm of movement deeper within the Abbey. Footsteps, perhaps, or the shifting of robes, or the repeated actions of people engaged in tasks that continue regardless of your awareness of them. Monastic life in the medieval period was highly structured, with continuous cycles of work and prayer that extended into night hours in many orders. Surviving records suggest that even when rest occurred, some form of activity often continued in designated areas. You move again. The corridor bends slightly, and the architecture becomes older in feeling. Stone here is less uniform, more textured, as if built across different phases of time. Many abbeys expanded gradually over centuries, incorporating new construction alongside older foundations. This layering creates complex internal geographies that do not always follow intuitive spatial logic. You notice this not as information, but as sensation. The space feels accumulated. You pass a recessed niche in the wall. Inside it is a faint mark carved into stone, not decorative in any obvious sense, but not purely functional either. Such markings in medieval monastic buildings are often interpreted as masons' marks, devotional symbols, or construction guides. There is no universal agreement on their meaning, and interpretations vary widely among researchers studying medieval craftsmanship and symbolic practices. You continue without stopping. The corridor begins to widen again. Now you are approaching another hall. This one is different from the guest hall. Smaller, lower, and more enclosed. The fire here is minimal, more symbolic than functional. It glows faintly in a shallow hearth, casting limited light across stone surfaces that absorb rather than reflect illumination. Figures are present, not many. They sit or stand in quiet arrangement, their presence subdued. Monastic communities often had designated spaces for reflection, reading, or nighttime preparation for prayer cycles, though the exact use of such rooms varied depending on order and local tradition. Some historical interpretations suggest these spaces functioned as transitional zones between activity and contemplation. You are not addressed, no one turns toward you. Instead, your presence is simply absorbed into the room's existing stillness. The guestmaster stands near the edge of the space. He does not move immediately. When he speaks, it is quiet, almost blending into the atmosphere. This is not your place of rest. The words are not corrective. They are descriptive, like a map being updated rather than a command being issued. You look around. The room feels less like destination and more like pause, a space between functions, between cycles of movement within the Abbey. You notice a doorway at the far end. It is open. Beyond it, darkness extends deeper into the structure. There is a sense that the Abbey continues beyond what you have already experienced, that what you have seen so far is only a portion of a larger internal system that extends in directions not yet revealed. Some medieval monastic complexes were known for their extensive networks of corridors, chapels, and service rooms, sometimes expanding organically over centuries. Archaeological studies often reveal unexpected complexity in these layouts. With spaces repurposed across generations for different functions, you move toward the doorway. The guestmaster does not follow immediately, but his presence remains behind you, steady and unchanged. As you pass through the threshold, the temperature shifts again, not colder or warmer, just different. The space beyond is quieter still. A long corridor stretches forward, lined with evenly spaced arches. Each arch frames a section of darkness that feels both empty and full at the same time. Light is minimal here, but not absent. It appears intermittently, as if responding to movement rather than existing independently. You walk. The rhythm of your steps becomes the only consistent measurement of time. Then even that begins to soften. The Abbey is no longer divided into clearly defined rooms or functions. It is becoming continuous architecture, where boundaries exist only as suggestions. You feel the structure around you, not as walls or ceilings, but as a unified presence that holds space together without requiring separation. The storm outside is no longer distinct. The guest hall, cloister, tower, scriptorium, infirmary, all of it feels present simultaneously in the background of awareness. You are within it, not moving through it, and the corridor continues forward, without urgency, without end, guiding you deeper into the layered stillness of the Abbey's night. The corridor does not end, it simply changes its manner of existing at some point. You stop expecting transitions between spaces. There is no longer a sense of moving from one room into another. Instead, the architecture becomes continuous, as if the Abbey has decided that separation is no longer necessary for your understanding of it. You walk, but even that word begins to feel unnecessary. The arches along the corridor repeat at measured intervals, though not perfectly identical. Each one carries subtle differences in wear, curvature, and stone texture. Surviving architectural studies of medieval monastic construction often note that even in highly ordered religious communities, absolute uniformity was rare. Variations in materials, weathering, and successive repairs created buildings that evolved slowly over time, accumulating history in their very structure. You pass beneath one arch that feels slightly lower than the others. It makes no sound, but your attention changes as you pass through it. Ahead, faint light appears again, not bright enough to illuminate the space fully, but enough to suggest presence. In many medieval abbeys, lighting in corridor systems was deliberately restrained during night hours, both to conserve resources and to maintain the rhythm of rest and prayer cycles. Contemporary records suggest that illumination often functioned more as guidance than visibility, shaping movement rather than revealing detail. You continue toward the light. The corridor opens into a space that feels unfamiliar. Though not entirely new, it is a library, or something like one. Shelves extend along the walls, filled with volumes and manuscripts, though their details are not fully distinct at first glance. The air here is different, less cold, more steel. It carries the faint scent of parchment, aged wood, and ink that has long since dried into permanence. You move slowly between the shelves. Medieval monastic libraries were not merely repositories of texts. They were active spaces of preservation and transmission, where scribes and scholars copied, corrected, and sometimes commented on works from antiquity and contemporary theology. Surviving inventories from certain abbeys reveal surprisingly extensive collections, though the scale and organisation varied widely between institutions. A faint sense of continuity settles here, as if knowledge itself is part of the architecture. You reach out slightly, though you do not touch anything. The books do not react, but the space feels aware of your presence in a way that earlier rooms did not. Not conscious awareness, but structural acknowledgement. As if your attention completes part of the environment's design. A soft sound emerges behind you. Footsteps. You turn. But there is no sudden reveal. Instead, a figure is already present at the edge of the space, the guest master, or what represents him here. He stands quietly among the shelves, not interrupting the stillness but integrated into it. His presence feels less like arrival and more like confirmation that this space is part of the same system you have been moving through all along. He does not speak immediately. Instead, he looks at you in a way that is not evaluative, but contextual. When he finally speaks, his voice is low. This is not for you to keep. The words are simple, but they shift the atmosphere slightly. You look around again. The manuscripts and books do not feel restricted, but they feel situated within a system of use and return. Monastic libraries often operated under strict rules of access and handling, particularly in medieval Europe, where texts were both valuable and fragile. Some historical records indicate that books were sometimes chained or carefully catalogued to prevent loss or damage, though practices differed significantly between orders and regions. You are not being denied knowledge, you are being reminded of its placement. The guestmaster turns and begins walking deeper into the library. You follow. The shelves become denser as you move forward, and the lighting becomes more concentrated. Here, small lamps or candles seem to exist in carefully controlled intervals, creating zones of illumination separated by soft darkness. The effect is not dramatic, but it is intentional in feel, guiding attention rather than flooding space. You notice that some manuscripts are open on reading stands, pages filled with script that is not fully readable from your position, yet still visually present enough to suggest density of thought. Medieval scriptoria and libraries often functioned as interconnected systems, where copying, storing, and studying texts formed continuous cycles of intellectual labour. Archaeological and textual evidence from surviving monastic centres supports the idea that literacy was both a practical skill and a spiritual discipline. You pass a desk where ink stains remain visible on worn wood. No one sits there now, but the impression of recent use lingers. A quieter detail emerges as you walk. The shelves are not strictly linear. They curve slightly, following the shape of the building rather than imposing geometric order upon it. This suggests that the library was adapted into existing architecture rather than constructed as a standalone conceptual space. The guestmaster pauses near a narrow opening. Beyond it, the library continues, but differently. The air feels thinner there, less layered with scent and sound. You step closer. Inside this section, the shelves are less populated. Gaps appear between manuscript. Some spaces are empty entirely. It creates a sense of incompletion, though not neglect. You sense that this is a place of transition. The guestmaster speaks again. What is here is not always kept. The phrase is not explained, but it does not require explanation. You move through the quieter section of the library. Here, the lighting is softer, and the shadows feel deeper. The absence of objects becomes part of the structure itself. Empty shelves do not feel abandoned. They feel available. Medieval monastic communities often experience cycles of loss and renewal in their libraries, with manuscripts damaged by time, fire, or political upheaval, and then gradually replaced or recopied. Surviving historical documentation shows that preservation was an ongoing process rather than a fixed achievement, though interpretations vary among modern researchers studying textual transmission in monastic environments. You stop briefly near one of the empty shelves. There is no object there, but the absence feels deliberate. You move on. At the far end of the library, another corridor appears. It leads downward. Not sharply, but gradually, you follow it. The temperature shifts again, becoming slightly cooler, but not uncomfortable. The architecture changes subtly as you descend. Stone becomes rougher, less refined, more foundational. It feels closer to the base structure of the Abbey, rather than its functional interiors. You realise you are no longer within a single identifiable space. You're within layers. Each layer is connected, but not identical. The guest master walks ahead without urgency, as if the path is already known and simply being retraced rather than discovered. You continue downward, and as you do, the idea of direction itself begins to lose importance. What matters now is the continuity of movement through a structure that no longer distinguishes between rooms, roles, or boundaries. It only continues. The descent does not feel like going downward anymore. It feels like moving closer to the foundation of something that has always been present beneath every space you have passed through. The corridor narrows slightly as you follow the guest master. Stone here is different in texture, less polished by centuries of foot traffic, more raw in its surface. It carries the sense of early construction phases, the kind of material chosen for strength rather than appearance. Medieval monastic complexes often reveal this layering when studied through excavation, where later decorative expansions sit above older, more functional foundations. You notice that sound changes again in this lower section. It is not quieter, it is denser. Each footstep seems to sink into the stone rather than echo from it. The architecture absorbs movement more than it reflects it. In many surviving monastic structures, lower levels were used for storage, utility rooms, and access routes for water and supplies. These spaces were rarely designed for comfort, but for endurance and function across long periods of use. The guest master remains a few steps ahead. His presence feels less like a guide now and more like a constant reference point. Something your awareness orients itself around without needing explicit instruction. You pass a series of arches that are slightly uneven, not broken but adjusted, as if the building itself has been repaired over time without fully erasing earlier versions of its structure. Archaeological studies of monastic sites frequently reveal this kind of architectural layering, where walls are patched, widened, or reinforced across centuries, creating structures that embody multiple historical phases at once. The air grows cooler, not sharply but steadily. It is the kind of cold that comes from deep stone, from areas that rarely see direct heat or light. You begin to sense that you are no longer in spaces intended for regular occupation. These corridors feel more like circulation routes within the building itself, pathways that allow movement between systems rather than destinations. A faint sound appears ahead, water, not flowing in a strong stream, but moving in controlled, deliberate intervals. Medieval monastic complexes often included sophisticated water management system with channels, cisterns, and drainage routes integrated into their design. Surviving archaeological evidence from various sites shows that water was not only functional but carefully distributed to support both daily life and long-term structural stability. The sound grows slightly clearer as you approach. You enter a wider space. This one feels different immediately. It is not a hall, and not a room in the usual sense. It is more like a junction point. The ceiling is higher, but irregular. Stone pillars support sections that do not align perfectly, suggesting multiple phases of construction and adaptation. Light is minimal, coming from narrow openings high above, where the storm outside faintly presses against the structure. Snow is not visible directly, but its presence is felt in the pressure of cold air descending through unseen gaps. You pause briefly. The guest master continues forward, then stops and waits. There is something in this space that demands stillness, not through instruction, but through atmosphere. You become aware of the sound of your own breathing more clearly than before. In lower sections of medieval monastic buildings, air circulation was often different due to structural depth and limited exposure to exterior openings. Some historical analyses suggest that these areas could feel significantly more stable in temperature, but heavier in air quality, especially in winter when ventilation was reduced. The guest master turns slightly. This is where the building remembers. The statement is not elaborated, but it lingers. You look around again. The junction space is not empty. It contains traces of function. Hooks in stone where objects may once have hung. Recesses that suggest storage or passage, markings along the walls that are worn too smooth to interpret clearly. Some archaeological interpretations of similar features in monastic complexes suggest they may have been used for logistical organisation, though exact purposes often remain uncertain due to limited documentation. You step forward slowly. The floor here is uneven in places, subtly sloping toward channels carved into the stone. Water likely once moved through these pathways, directed away from living areas or towards specific collection points. Medieval engineering in monastic contexts often included carefully designed drainage systems, reflecting both practical necessity and long-term architectural foresight. The sound of water becomes more distinct. It is not loud but persistent. The guest master leads you toward one of the openings at the far side of the junction. Beyond it, the corridor continues, but lower still. You hesitate briefly, not out of fear, but out of recognition that you are moving into a part of the structure that feels less like passage and more like origin. You follow anyway. The corridor narrows again. Walls press closer, though not in an oppressive way. It feels more like focus than confinement. The architecture here is less about openness and more about direction. Medieval monastic buildings often included service corridors and foundational passageways that connected essential systems beneath the more visible layers of communal life. You notice that the stone changes colour slightly, darker in tone, more saturated with age and moisture. The guest master stops near another opening. This one leads into a long, low chamber. He does not enter immediately. You step closer. Inside, the chamber stretches forward into dimness. Along one side, a series of stone basins or channels run parallel to the wall. Water moves through them slowly, controlled by unseen gradients in the structure. The system is ancient but still active and feeling, as if the building continues to regulate its internal flows even now. Medieval monastic sites often incorporated water systems that supported kitchens, gardens, and sanitation needs. Surviving archaeological documentation shows that these systems could be remarkably advanced, with careful attention to gravity flow and seasonal variation, though the extent of their sophistication varied widely across regions and monastic orders. You move into the chamber. The sound of water becomes more present, though still restrained. It does not rush, it circulates. You follow the channels visually as they extend deeper into the structure, disappearing into stone openings that suggest further systems beyond immediate perception. The guest master remains at the entrance. He speaks quietly. Not everything here is seen. The words are simple, but they feel expansive. You continue forward. The chamber begins to widen slightly as you move deeper inside. The ceiling lowers in some sections and rises in others, creating a rhythm of compression and release within the architecture. It feels less like a straight space and more like a system designed for flow, both of water and movement. You notice faint markings again on the walls, not decorative, but functional in appearance, linears, grooves, and carved indicators that may have guided construction or maintenance processes. Medieval building practices often relied on such markings, though their precise meanings are not always fully understood by modern interpretation. You stop briefly at one of the channels. Water passes through it slowly, reflecting faint light from above. It is clear but not still. The guest master approaches from behind, stopping at a respectful distance. This is not where guests usually go. His tone is neutral, observational. You look back at him, then forward again. The chamber extends further than you can see. The feeling here is not of conclusion, but of continuation beyond visible boundaries. You begin walking again, and as you do, the sense of the Abbey shifts once more. It is no longer above or around you. It is beneath you, surrounding you, and continuing beyond perception. A system of stone, water, and silence that extends further than any single room or moment can contain, and you move through it as part of its ongoing structure. The chamber does not end in any clear way. It simply becomes less defined as you move deeper into it, as if the architecture itself is reluctant to declare a final boundary. The water channels continue along the stone floor beside you, their movements steady and restrained. You notice how the sound has become part of your awareness rather than something external. It is no longer something you hear and interpret, it is something you exist alongside. The guest master walks a short distance behind you now, not leading, not following, but maintaining presence at a distance that feels deliberate. His silence carries the same weight as the stone around you, as if both are part of the same system of restraint and structure. The air in this lower chamber is different again. It's not simply colder or warmer, it is older in feeling, dense in a way that suggests long accumulation. Medieval monastic foundations often reveal this kind of layered atmosphere in excavation reports, where subterranean spaces preserve traces of humidity, mineral scent, and slow air exchange shaped by centuries of controlled water movement. You pass another bend in the channel. The water here widens slightly, pooling before narrowing again into a carved passage. This controlled modulation suggests intentional design, likely intended to regulate flow rather than simply direct it. Surviving engineering studies of monastic water systems show that such variations were common, allowing excess water to be temporarily held before redistribution or drainage. You stop briefly. The guest master does not speak, but his presence pauses with you. The chamber ahead opens into a larger space again. Though still underground, you move forward. The room you enter feels different from anything before. It is not a hall of gathering or a corridor of passage, it is a utility space, shaped by function rather than ritual. Stone pillars support a ceiling that is uneven, as if formed across different construction phases. The floor is slightly damp, and the sound of water is stronger here, echoing faintly off multiple surfaces. Along one wall, the channels converge into a broader basin system. The water slows here, collecting before dispersing again through smaller carved routes. Medieval monastic complexes often integrated such distribution points into their infrastructure, allowing water to be redirected for washing, irrigation, or controlled drainage depending on seasonal needs. Archaeological evidence from excavated sites suggests that these systems could be remarkably adaptable, though interpretations differ regarding how centrally they were managed. You step closer to the basin. The surface of the water reflects faint, unstable light from above. It does not mirror the room clearly. Instead, it seems to reflect movement rather than form. The guest master speaks softly. Everything here returns. The phrase is not explained, but it lingers in the chamber like a structural principle rather than a statement. You look around again. The space feels cyclical. Water enters, moves, collects, and disperses. Stone contains, redirects, and returns pressure into flow. Even the air seems to circulate in patterns that are not immediately visible but strongly implied by temperature shifts along the walls. You move along the edge of the basin. Your footsteps are quieter here, not because sound is absent, but because it is absorbed differently. Lower monastic spaces often exhibit this dampening effect due to moisture content and dense stone construction. According to environmental analyses of surviving medieval structures, The guest master remains near the entrance. Watching without emphasis, you continue forward into a narrower passage that leads out of the basin chamber. The corridor beyond is tighter, almost tunnel-like in places. The stone here feels more compressed, less shaped for movement and more shaped for containment. You begin to sense that you're approaching the deepest part of the structure you've encountered so far. A faint vibration passes through the walls. It is subtle, almost imperceptible. Then it repeats, not a bell this time, something lower, more internal. Medieval monastic complexes sometimes incorporated mechanical or environmental resonances from water flow, wind channels, or structural vibration that could be felt rather than clearly heard. Surviving analyses of subterranean sections suggest that such sensations were often interpreted differently depending on cultural or spiritual context. Though modern interpretations tend to focus on engineering explanations, you stop briefly in the corridor. The vibration continues. It is not rhythmic like bells, it is irregular, but consistent in presence. You move again. The passage opens into a final chamber. This space is larger, but not in a welcoming way. It feels like expansion under constraint, as if the building had to create more room here for something it could not compress further. The water channels end here, or rather, they converge. All flow leads into a single basin carved into the centre of the floor. The basin is deep, circular, and still. The water inside it is not moving in visible currents, but it is not entirely still either. There is a sense of depth that exceeds its physical boundaries, as if the water continues downward beyond what stone contains. The guestmaster approaches the edge of the chamber, but does not enter fully. You stand closer to the basin. The surface reflects faint light from openings high above. Though those openings are barely visible, medieval monastic water systems sometimes included final collection points like this, where excess water from higher levels was gathered before being redirected or released. Archaeological interpretations vary on whether such basins were purely functional or held additional symbolic meaning within certain communities. You lean slightly forward. The reflection does not show your face clearly. It shows movement, the sense of the abbey above, the corridors, the cloister, the guest hall, all layered into shifting impressions within the water's surface. The guestmaster speaks again. It is not only above you. The words are quiet but firm. You look at him, then back at the basin. The vibration returns. Stronger this time, it moves through the chamber, through stone, through water, through your awareness of space itself. You realize that what you have been moving through is not just architecture in the conventional sense. It is a system of circulation, of water, of movement, of presence. Everything connects through controlled pathways, descending, collecting, returning. The chamber feels less like an endpoint now, and more like a center. The guestmaster steps back slightly, leaving but making his space. You remain at the edge of the basin. The water continues its subtle, unreadable motion, and the abbey, in all its layered depth, feels momentarily suspended in a single continuous breath. The basin does not change, but your awareness of it does. At first, it is only water held within carved stone, a final convergence point in the subterranean network you have been following. Yet as you stand there longer, something subtle begins to shift in how the space presents itself. The surface is no longer just reflecting light from above. It seems to be holding layers of movement beneath itself, as if the water is not a boundary but a membrane. The guestmaster remains near the edge of the chamber. He does not step closer, he does not step away. His stillness feels intentional, like a part of the structure that has been assigned temporary motion but not autonomy. Medieval monastic systems often relied on clearly defined roles within maintenance and oversight of complex infrastructure. Surviving documentation from various abbeys suggests that water systems in particular were monitored with consistent attention. especially in winter months when freezing and overflow could disrupt entire sections of a building. You lean slightly forward. The reflection in the basin becomes less recognizable as reflection. It is not distorted in a physical sense. It is layered. The surface seems to carry impressions of spaces you have already passed through, though not in chronological order. The cloister appears briefly, then the guest hall, then the tower, each emerging and fading without sequence. You straighten again, the water settles, though not completely. A faint vibration moves through the chamber once more. It's not external sound. It feels internal to the architecture itself. Some archaeological interpretations of subterranean monastic chambers suggest that water movement combined with structural resonance could produce low-frequency vibrations perceptible to the body rather than the ear. These sensations are often described differently depending on cultural framing, but they are consistently noted in accounts of deep foundation spaces. You take a slow step around the basin. The stone floor is damp, but stable. Each step produces almost no echo, as if sound is being absorbed before it can reflect. The guestmaster finally speaks again. This is not where things end. His voice remains calm, but there is a shift in emphasis now, not urgency, but clarification. You look at him, then back to the basin. The water surface shows movement again, but not random movement. It is directional, though the direction does not correspond to physical flow. Instead, it resembles circulation of memory across spaces that are no longer distinct. You begin to notice that the chamber itself is responding subtly to your attention. When you focus on one area, it becomes more defined. When you shift away, it softens again. This is not alteration in physical structure, but in perceptual clarity. Medieval monastic architecture often interacted with natural light, sound, and temperature in ways that changed perception throughout the day. Though what you are experiencing now extends beyond normal environmental variation, the guestmaster moves slightly closer to the basin, not entering the circle around it, but nearing its edge. He places one hand near the stone rim, not touching the water. The gesture is not functional. It is referential. Everything returns here, he says again. This time, the phrase carries more weight, though it still lacks an explanation. You notice that the water is not only reflecting spaces now, it is reflecting transitions, doors closing, corridors turning, light changing in upper rooms. The sense of movement across the Abbey is condensed into surface patterns that do not behave like normal reflection. A subtle realization begins forming, though it does not complete itself into certainty. The system you have been moving through is not linear. It is cyclical, or perhaps layered in such a way that linear movement is only one interpretation of it. Medieval monastic complexes with advanced water management systems often incorporated recycling flows, where water used in upper areas was redirected through lower channels before being returned or released. Surviving engineering reconstructions show that these systems could be surprisingly interconnected, though interpretations vary widely regarding whether symbolic meaning was intentionally embedded in their design or whether such readings are modern impositions. You step closer to the basin again. The surface does not react physically, but your perception of depth changes. It feels less like looking into water and more like looking through it. The guestmaster withdraws his hand slightly. He does not look at you directly now. Instead, his gaze remains on the basin. There is something in the chamber that feels like waiting, but not in a temporal sense. More like readiness. You kneel slightly at the edge, the water remains calm yet layered. You notice now that it is not showing past spaces in sequence, it is showing them simultaneously. The cloister arches overlap with the scriptorium shelves. The guest hall fire appears within the tower's vertical lines. The infirmary herbs emerge within corridor shadows. These images are not separate. They coexist within a single surface state. A faint pressure builds in the air. It's not physical pressure, but a tensional density. You realise that sound is absent here in a different way than before. It is not silence, it is redistribution. Sound exists, but it is dispersed across layers too deep to isolate. The guest master finally speaks again. You're not only passing through, the statement is incomplete, but it does not need completion. You remain still. The basin continues to show movement that is not movement. Medieval monastic spaces were often designed with overlapping functional zones, where water, heat, labour, and prayer systems intersected across different structural levels. Archaeological studies of abbey complexes suggest that these intersections created highly efficient but complex internal networks. Though interpretations differ regarding whether their design was purely practical or also intended to reflect theological ideas of unity and return. You place one hand lightly on the stone near the basin. It is cold, not sharply but deeply. The cold feels like it extends beyond the stone itself, into something underlying the structure. The guestmaster steps back slightly for the first time. His posture changes in a way that suggests transition rather than instruction. The basin's surface begins to stabilize again, not becoming still, but becoming coherent. The overlapping images begin to align. You see the guest cell again, the straw mattress, the small window, the storm outside, but now it is not isolated. It is connected to everything else, a flow between spaces rather than a separate place. You withdraw your hand from the stone. The chamber remains unchanged physically, but something in how it is perceived has shifted irreversibly. The guestmaster turns slightly. The next step is not here. His words are quiet. Not directive, confirming. You look once more at the basin. The water now shows only faint movement. Not reflection, not memory. Something closer to continuity itself. You rise slowly, and the chamber, in its deep and layered stillness, feels less like a destination than a central node in a system that continues beyond what you have yet seen. You rise from the edge of the basin, and for a brief moment nothing else changes. The chamber remains as it was stone. Water, dim light filtering from unseen openings above. Yet the sense of continuity that had been building begins to reorganize itself again. It is not a break, not a shift in place, but a reorientation in how the space presents itself to you. The guestmaster steps back first, not leaving, just creating distance that feels deliberate, as though proximity now serves a different purpose than guidance. You notice the water again. It is calmer than before, but not still. The surface no longer shows layered images of other parts of the abbey. Instead, it reflects something simpler movement reduced to essence. Flow without destination, circulation without interruption. In many medieval monastic engineering systems, water was treated not as a static resource but as a continuous cycle, managed through gravity and carefully designed channels that redistributed it across multiple functions. Surviving reconstructions of abbey infrastructure suggest that these systems were maintained with remarkable consistency, though interpretations vary regarding whether their design carried symbolic intention or remained purely practical. You take a slow step away from the basin. The sound of your movement is still minimal, absorbed by the damp stone. The chamber feels slightly different now that you're no longer standing directly beside the water. Not emptier, but less focused, as if the basin had been a point of concentration and stepping away allows the space to diffuse again into its broader structure. The guestmaster turns. He does not gesture this time. He simply begins walking. You follow. The corridor beyond the chamber is narrower than expected, but familiar in its cold texture. The air here carries the same layered stillness you have felt in lower sections of the abbey, though now it feels less like descent and more like transition between systems. Medieval monastic architecture often connected utility spaces with upper living quarters through carefully arranged passageways, though the complexity of these networks is still interpreted differently among researchers studying large abbey complexes. You walk. The sound of water fades behind you, but does not disappear. It becomes part of the background structure of the building again, no longer central but still present. The corridor bends gently upward. This time, the ascent is more noticeable. Not physically steep, but perceptually clear. You're moving towards spaces that feel less dense, less saturated with accumulated presence. Stone here becomes smoother again, more refined in its surface, suggesting either later construction phases or more frequently used passageways. The guestmaster remains a few steps ahead. His presence is steady, but no longer interpretive. He is not explaining the space anymore. He is simply moving within it. You pass a small recess in the wall. Inside it, faint carvings appear again, not elaborate, but intentional. Lines intersecting in simple geometric patterns. Medieval monastic buildings often included such markings, sometimes associated with construction planning, sometimes with symbolic or devotional purposes. Surviving studies of stonework in abbeys across Europe indicate that these marks were not standardized, and their meanings often remain uncertain. Shaped by regional practice and individual craftsmanship, you continue. The corridor opens slightly. A faint change in air pressure signals proximity to larger space. Then you enter it. The cloister returns. But it does not feel like return in a narrative sense. It feels like reintegration into a layer of the structure that has been present throughout all previous experiences. The arches are familiar now, yet not identical to earlier impressions. Light shifts differently here. The central guard is still covered in snow, but the surface appears less like accumulation and more like a resting layer over something that remains active beneath. You walk along the arcade. The guestmaster slows slightly but does not stop. Your footsteps echo faintly now, though still softened by stone and distance. Some medieval monastic cloisters were designed to serve as central circulation spaces that connected all major functional zones of the abbey. Architectural surveys of surviving complexes show that these spaces were often the most structurally stable and continuously maintained parts of the buildings, reflecting their importance in daily monastic rhythm. You pass beneath an arch that feels slightly warmer than the others, not in temperature, but in perception. The cloister garden draws your attention again. For a moment, the snow seems less uniform. There is a suggestion of structure beneath it, not visible but implied. Herb beds, pathways, geometric arrangement. Cloister gardens in medieval monasteries were often designed with both practical and contemplative purposes, though the balance between symbolism and utility varies widely among surviving interpretations. You continue without stopping. The guestmaster leads you toward a side passage. This one is different from earlier corridors. It is wider, better lit, and less enclosed. As you enter, the atmosphere shifts again. You're moving upward. The architecture becomes more refined. Stonework transitions into more regular patterns. Arches more symmetrical, surfaces more carefully finished. This suggests proximity to more commonly used upper spaces of the abbey, where daily communal life, prayer and administration would have taken place. You notice sound returning in subtle ways, not bells yet, but distant movement, footsteps, faint voices, controlled and measured. Medieval monastic communities often structured their upper-level spaces for reading, prayer, and administrative tasks, with strict regulation of noise and movement during certain hours. Surviving records indicate that even in active periods, sound was moderated to preserve the contemplative environment. You enter another hall. This one is brighter than previous spaces, not bright in a modern sense, but noticeably more illuminated. Light filters through higher windows, softened by winter conditions outside. Snow outside the abbey reflects ambient brightness inward, creating a muted glow that spreads across stone surfaces. Tables are present here. Though fewer than in the guest hall, the space feels transitional again. Not destination, but passage between functions. The guestmaster stops. For the first time in a while, He turns fully toward you. You notice that his expression is not instructive or evaluative. It is neutral in a way that suggests completion of a phase rather than initiation of another. He speaks quietly. You have seen what is beneath. The words are simple, but they mark a shift. You look around the hall again. It feels less like structure now and more like integration of all previous spaces. The cloister, the tower, the library, the infirmary, the water chamber, the basin. All of it feels present in reduced form, as if this level of the Abbey contains echoes of everything below. Medieval monastic complexes often exhibited this kind of layered spatial organisation, where upper communal areas were built above increasingly functional or infrastructural lower levels. Archaeological studies suggest that this vertical stratification was both practical and adaptive, though interpretations differ regarding its symbolic implications. You take a slow breath. The air here is easier, less dense, more aligned with breathing itself. The guestmaster steps slightly aside, not leaving, but allowing space to expand beyond the hall. Another corridor leads outward toward what feels like the edge of the Abbey's internal system. You sense that movement is still possible, but direction is no longer structured in the same way. What remains is awareness of continuity, where each space you have experienced is not separate but part of a single, interconnected system that extends both upward and downward beyond immediate perception. And as you stand there, the Abbey no longer feels like a place you entered. It feels like a structure you've been moving within all along at every level at once. The hall you stand in no longer feels like a transition point. It feels like a settling place, though not in the sense of rest or conclusion. More like a structure that has finished revealing itself in layers and is now simply allowing you to remain within its full presence. The guestmaster does not move immediately. He stands slightly to one side, as if his role in guiding motion has reached its limit. There is no sense of dismissal in his posture, only completion. Medieval monastic spaces often operated through carefully structured transitions between roles and areas, where guidance ended once understanding or placement was achieved. Surviving accounts from monastic rule traditions suggest that movement within such spaces was as regulated as silence or speech, though interpretations of how strictly this was enforced vary among scholars of religious life in the period. You look around the hall again. Light filters through high windows, softened by the winter outside. Snow beyond the glass reflects pale brightness inward, giving the stone surfaces a muted glow that shifts subtly as clouds move. The effect is not dramatic, but steady, as if the entire space is breathing with the weather. You notice details you might have missed before. The walls here are more refined than in lower chambers. Stone blocks are evenly cut, joints carefully aligned. This suggests later construction or significant restoration over time. Archaeological studies of monastic architecture often reveal this kind of progression, where upper communal spaces were periodically updated, while lower infrastructural areas remained closer to their original construction phases. You take a slow step forward. Your footsteps feel more present now, not louder, but more clearly defined within the space. The guestmaster finally speaks again. This is where things return to the day. The words are calm, almost observational, not instruction, but clarification of structure. You pause. The hall feels different when you stop moving, not changing in form, but in emphasis. It becomes more clearly a place of activity rather than passage. In medieval monastic life, upper halls like this often served as focal points for communal rhythm, including shared meals, readings, and administrative coordination. Surviving records from various abbeys indicate that these spaces were central to daily cycles, especially in winter months when outdoor activity was limited. You move closer to one of the windows. The glass is uneven, slightly distorted, made from small segments joined together. Light passing through it bends subtly, creating soft, irregular patterns on the stone floor. Medieval glass-making techniques produced surfaces that were functional but rarely uniform, and surviving architectural evidence shows that such imperfections were common and accepted as part of construction. Outside, the storm is still present, but it is no longer dominant in perception. It exists beyond the structure rather than against it. You notice movement in the hall again. A few figures pass through the space. Monks or attendants, their robes dark against the pale light. Their movements are measured, purposeful, but not hurried. Monastic communities structured their upper-level spaces to support continuous cycles of work and prayer, and surviving documentation suggests that movement within these areas was carefully regulated to maintain both efficiency and contemplation. You step away from the window. The guest master begins walking towards another section of the hall. You follow. The space opens slightly as you move, revealing additional passages branching from the main hall. These lead to different functional areas, though their exact purposes are not immediately clear. Medieval monastic architecture often included interconnected upper-level rooms for study, record-keeping, and administrative functions. Though the specific layout varied significantly between institutions, you pass through an archway. The temperature shifts subtly again. Warmer here, not from fire, but from occupancy. You enter a smaller chamber. This one contains tables and writing materials. Ink, parchment, quills, a scriptorium-like space, though less formal than the one you experienced earlier in the dream sequence. Monastic scriptoria were essential to the preservation and transmission of knowledge in medieval Europe, and surviving historical records indicate that writing and copying texts was one of the most structured intellectual activities within such communities. You observe without touching. The guest master remains near the doorway. He does not enter fully. "This space continues," he says quietly. The phrase does not require response. Do you look around again? The room feels active, though not currently in use. Ink stains mark the edges of tables. Pages lie neatly arranged. There is a sense that work pauses here rather than ends. You continue walking through the chamber. Another corridor leads out the far side. This one is brighter. You follow it. As you move, you begin to notice something novel about the structure of the Abbey at this level. It is less about containment and more about distribution. Light, sound, movement, and function all seem to circulate more freely here. In contrast to the lower chambers where systems converged and controlled flow, the upper spaces feel like points of dispersion, where activity spreads outward into multiple directions. You reach a wider opening, a gallery or elevated walkway. From here, parts of the Abbey are visible again in layered perspective, a cloister below, partially obscured, courtyards beyond, rooflines covered in snow. The storm is still active outside, but it feels distant now, filtered through structure and height. Medieval monastic complexes often used elevated walkways and galleries to connect key areas while maintaining separation between public and private or sacred and functional zones. Archaeological studies of surviving abbeys show that these vertical connections were essential for efficient movement within large complexes. You pause at the railing. The stone is cold beneath your hand. Below, movement continues in smaller forms, figures passing through cloisters. Distant echoes of activity in lower halls. The entire structure feels visible at once. Though not fully comprehensible in a single view, the guestmaster stands slightly behind you. He does not interrupt your observation. Instead, he speaks softly again. You understand the shape now. The words are not a question. You look out again over the layered architecture. Something in the perception of the Abbey shifts again. It is no longer experienced as sequence. It is experienced as structure. Lower levels, upper halls, corridors, water systems, cloisters, towers, all existing as parts of a single integrated system rather than a series of separate locations. Medieval monastic architecture, when studied as a whole, reveals this kind of interconnected design logic. Even when individual components served specific purposes, they were embedded within a larger organizational framework that ensured continuity of function across space and time. You exhale slowly. The air feels balanced now, not heavy, not light, just present. The guest master steps closer to the edge of the gallery. He does not gesture. He simply remains there. And for the first time since you entered the Abbey, there is a sense not of being guided through it, but of standing within it as a complete system, all its layers present simultaneously. The storm outside continues, but it no longer defines contrast. The Abbey is no longer shelter from it. It is simply another form of continuity within it. And as you stand there, the structure feels less like something you have travelled through and more like something you now understand from within, from the elevated gallery. The Abbey no longer feels like a place you are inside, it feels like something you are part of, observing from within itself. The structure stretches in layered clarity below you, cloisters forming quiet squares of movement, corridors threading between functional spaces, towers rising into winter air, and lower foundations holding the slow, continuous circulation of water and stone. Everything exists at once, not as separate zones, but as a unified system of relationships. You notice how light behaves differently at this height. It is not brighter, it is more distributed. The winter sky outside filters through multiple angles of glass and open space, scattering pale illumination across surfaces that were never intended to reflect it evenly. Medieval monastic complexes often relied on this kind of indirect winter lighting, especially in northern regions where daylight was limited for much of the year. Surviving architectural analyses suggest that upper-level spaces were designed to maximize what little ambient light was available, though interpretations vary on whether this was purely functional or also symbolic in intent. The guest master stands slightly behind you. He's no longer guiding in any active sense. He is present, but not directing. You sense that his role has shifted into confirmation rather than instruction, as if the structure itself no longer requires mediation between you and its form. Below, movement continues. Small figures pass through cloister walkways, their motions slow and deliberate. The garden remains covered in snow, but its geometry is still visible beneath the surface pattern. In many medieval monastic traditions, cloister gardens were arranged according to symbolic or practical layouts, often incorporating medicinal herbs, walking paths, and reflective spaces. Archaeological studies of surviving sites show consistent patterns of structured planting, though exact interpretations of their design intentions remain varied among researchers. You rest your hand lightly on the stone railing. It is cold, but steady. The stone here feels less like material and more like accumulated structure. Each layer beneath this level supports another, and together they form something that extends far beyond immediate perception. You begin to notice a shift in how sound behaves. It is not silence, it is integration. Footsteps below, faint voices, distant water movement, even the wind outside the Abbey walls. All of it blends into a continuous background presence rather than distinct signals. In large medieval monastic complexes, sound often travelled through interconnected corridors and open courtyards in complex ways, and environmental studies of surviving structures suggest that acoustic layering was an inevitable result of architectural design and material choice. You close your eyes briefly. When you open them again, your awareness of the Abbey has changed. It is no longer composed of locations, it is composed of flows. Movement flows through corridors, water flows through stone channels, light flows through upper windows. People move through these flows in cycles of work, prayer, and rest that repeat across time. The guest master speaks quietly behind you. You see it now as it is. The statement is not rhetorical, it is descriptive. You look again over the structure. Something in the perception settles further. The Abbey is not a collection of spaces, it is a system of circulation. Upper halls distribute activity. Cloisters regulate movement. Lower chambers manage water and structural flow. The guest rooms, kitchens, libraries, and infirmary spaces all function as points within a larger network that sustains itself through repetition and balance. Medieval monastic architecture, as reconstructed from archaeological and documentary sources, often reveals this underlying logic of interdependence. While individual buildings served specific purposes, they were rarely isolated in function, instead forming part of a continuous operational environment. You step slightly along the gallery. The perspective shifts again. From here, you can trace movement pathways more clearly. A figure crosses the cloister below, another disappears into a corridor. Light shifts in upper windows as clouds move across the winter sky outside. The storm is still present, but it feels distant, not because it has weakened, but because it is no longer the dominant system of reference. The Abbey has become its own environment. The guest master moves closer to your side. He does not interrupt your view. He simply stands. There is a quiet sense of transition in his posture now, not departure, but completion of function. You notice something else in the structure below. Patterns. Repeated rhythms of movement and stillness. Activity clusters in certain areas at certain intervals. These cycles are not random. They reflect the structured nature of monastic life, where daily routines were organized around prayer hours, labor periods, and communal meals. Surviving historical records from monastic institutions indicate that time was divided into carefully maintained segments, though interpretations of their consistency across different orders vary among researchers. You follow one of these patterns visually. It leads from cloister to corridor to lower chamber, then upward again toward lighted spaces. A continuous loop. You begin to understand that what you've been moving through is not linear experience, but traversal across layers of a repeating system. The guestmaster speaks again. There is no outside of it in the way you are thinking. The words are calm, but precise. You look outward again. The storm outside the Abbey is still visible through distant openings, but it no longer feels separate. It feels like another layer of circulation interacting with the structure rather than opposing it. Wind, snow, temperature shifts. All of it becomes part of a broader environmental system that includes, but does not define the Abbey. You rest both hands now on the stone railing. The cold remains consistent below. A bell sounds faintly, not as a sharp signal, but as part of the ongoing rhythm in medieval monastic life. Bells were integrated into daily structure, marking transitions between prayer cycles, work periods, and rest. Acoustic studies of surviving bell towers suggest that their sound was designed to carry across entire complexes, reinforcing temporal coordination across spatial distance. Here, the bell does not feel like marking time. It feels like maintaining continuity. You exhale slowly. The structure feels stable in a way that is not physical alone. It is systemic. The guestmaster steps back slightly. His presence is no longer central to your awareness. You realize that he has not been guiding you toward understanding. He has been allowing you to reach a point where understanding becomes self-evident through structure alone. Below, the Abbey continues its cycles. Above, winter light shifts through clouds. Within, everything remains connected through flows that do not begin or end, and as you stand there on the gallery, the sense of separation between observer and system begins to thin further, until even that distinction feels optional. The understanding does not arrive as a conclusion. It arrives as a settling. You remain on the elevated gallery, but even that location feels less like a fixed position and more like a point within a larger continuity. The Abbey beneath you no longer appears as separate floors or distinct chambers. It has become a single, layered system of movement, where everything exists in relation rather than isolation. The guestmaster stands beside you for a final time. He does not speak immediately. His presence feels quieter now, not because he has diminished, but because there is nothing left that requires framing or explanation. Below, the cloister continues its slow rhythm. figures move along the arcades, passing through arches softened by winter light. The garden remains covered in snow, yet its geometry still suggests structure beneath. Corridors connect without interruption. Lower chambers hold steady flows of water through carved stone channels. Upper halls diffuse light across stone surfaces shaped by centuries of use. Medieval monastic complexes, as understood through archaeological reconstruction and surviving records, often reveal this kind of integrated design where architecture functions as a continuous system. Space was not separated purely by purpose, but arranged to sustain cycles of life that included prayer, labour, rest, and maintenance. Interpretation of how consciously symbolic this integration was varies among modern researchers, but the structural coherence itself is widely recognised. You rest your hands on the cold stone railing. It no longer feels like boundary, it feels like interface. The guestmaster finally speaks. You do not leave this place the way you entered it. The words are simple, but they do not imply direction or instruction. They describe transition. You look out over the Abbey again. The storm outside continues, though it is no longer something that presses against the structure. It has become part of the surrounding environment, interacting with stone, light, and temperature in ways that are absorbed into the broader system. Winter no longer feels external, it feels integrated. You begin to notice that your perception of distance has changed. Lower levels are not far below. Upper spaces are not above in the usual sense. Everything is present at once, layered rather than separated. Movement through the Abbey now feels less like traversal and more like shifting attention between states within a single continuous structure. The guestmaster turns slightly toward you. His role is no longer to guide. It is to mark completion of observation. Below, a bell sounds once. It is not louder than before, but it's clearer. In medieval monastic life, bells were used not only for marking prayer cycles, but also for maintaining shared rhythm across complex architectural spaces. Surviving historical interpretations suggest that their function extended beyond simple timekeeping, though the extent of symbolic intention embedded in their acoustic design remains open to scholarly discussion. Here, the bell feels less like signal and more like confirmation of continuity. You take a slow breath. The air is steady, not warm, not cold, balanced in a way that no longer draws attention to itself. You realize that the Abbey has not changed. Your perception of it has. What once appeared as separate rooms, corridors, and systems is now understood as a unified structure of circulation. Water moves through stone channels not as isolated infrastructure, but as part of a broader environmental cycle. Light shifts through windows not as illumination, but as distribution. Movement of people, sound, and air all participate in the same underlying rhythm. The guestmaster steps slightly away from your side, not leaving, but no longer positioned as intermediary. You understand now that there was no hidden layer beneath the Abbey waiting to be found in a literal sense. Instead, there was a shift in how layers relate to each other. Each space retains its identity, but none exist independently. The cloister below continues its measured pace. The guest hall maintains its warmth. The scriptorium holds its stillness. The infirmary preserves its quiet order. The water system continues its slow, controlled circulation. The tower remains open to wind and sound. All of it exists simultaneously. You close your eyes briefly. When you open them again, nothing has changed, but everything is present more fully. The guestmaster speaks one final time. Remember this structure. The phrase is not instruction for action. It is acknowledgement of perception. You look outward again. The Abbey is no longer something you move through. It is something that continues whether you observe it or not. A system of stone, water, light, sound, and movement, sustained by cycles that extend beyond any single moment of awareness. Below, a figure crosses the cloister again. The movement is simple, repetitive, part of a rhythm that does not require interpretation. Above, winter light shifts across clouds. The storm continues without emphasis. Within, everything remains connected through flows that do not begin or end, only continue. You feel no urgency to leave, no need to remain. Both ideas lose relevance within this structure of understanding. The guestmaster steps back fully now. His presence fades into the architecture, not disappearing, but becoming indistinguishable from the system itself. And as you stand there, the final shift occurs quietly. You're no longer only observing the Abbey, you're aware of it as a continuous whole, with yourself as one temporary point of perception within its ongoing structure. The night does not end. It continues through sun, through water, through silence, through movement, and everything within it remains part of the same uninterrupted design. Slow, layered, complete, sweet dreams,